Section 28 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. German Bay. German Bay, lying close to Akaroa as it does, is closely associated with its history. It was settled as soon as any other bay on the peninsula, and when the whole place was a forest wild, was considered as one of the most fertile and convenient spots for habitation by the pioneers. It is not exactly known when Akaroa, German, and the other bays around the harbour were first chosen as places of settlement by white men. It must have been very early in the century, however, when runaway sailors sought a home in the bush in preference to cruising after whales. Several of these men lived with the Maoris and took Maori women for wives. Some stray sailors lived alone in the bush, and German Bay was one of their retreats, it being then easy to live on the natural products of the land. This bay was of course no exception to the rest of the peninsula as regards the bush, which was once very thick and heavy. The space, however, we are informed, which is on the seaward side of the present road, was fairly clear, and here the first settlers built their whares. Wild pigs, besides pigeons, kakas, and other birds abounded, and fish was plentiful, so it did not require much exertion to obtain a supply of provisions. As we all know, Captain Langlois is said to have purchased from the Maoris a great part of our peninsula, a block consisting of many thousand acres. This block of land extended from Peraki to Pigeon Bay, and included all the land round the harbour with the exception of one or two small places. A boat, it is believed, and some articles of merchandise were the payment for the land. £240 was to be the value of the goods given in exchange for this great stretch of fertile country. But it was never proved that anything like that amount was given to the natives, and the captain gave up his rights on returning to France to a company by name the Nantes Bordelais Company. Captain Langlois brought out the Comte de Paris for this company with immigrants. The vessel arrived in Akaroa harbour on 16th of August 1840, just 7 months after the New Zealand Company brought out emigrants to Nelson and Wellington. There were 60 emigrants by the Comte de Paris, and the company granted them 5 acres of land on arrival, to be chosen where they pleased, and 18 months' provisions and all necessary tools. Mrs. Marmonge and Mr. Verkele are the only residents remaining who came here under this company. Mr. Lelièvre came about the same time, but he arrived in a whaler. There were 6 Germans who came out with the French settlers. Messrs. Verkele, Breitmeier, and Peter Volta were among them. All the Germans formed a settlement in what is now German Bay, the place thus getting its name. They chose their 5 acres apiece there. A track was cut to Akaroa, and the timber in the bush being so good, the settlers employed themselves in pit sawing. The land was excellent for cultivation, but growing vegetables on a large scale didn't pay, as there were no people to whom to sell them, although the Maoris would now and then buy potatoes. Patches of ground in the clearing were sown down in wheat, as flour was a rarity, and the settlers felt the want of it very much, only being able to get a little when a whaler anchored in the harbour. The yield was very great. Even when these early settlers came, the Maoris round the harbour were not numerous. The French thought, however, that it was as well to take precautions, as their man-of-war could not always stay in harbour to protect, so a guardhouse was built in German Bay close to the beach. But luckily it was never required for the purpose intended. Just after the arrival of the immigrants, the New Zealand Company sent down a Mr. Robinson to act as a resident magistrate and a constable. This was rather officious on the part of the British, as New Zealand was not declared a British colony until 1841. This gentleman afterwards bought land in German Bay. By degrees, as the bush was cleared in German Bay, the English flocked there, and soon outnumbered the original settlers. As may be supposed, there were some large bushfires, but little damage was done to the inhabitants, who took precautions in time. Captain Mutter, afterwards Colonel Mutter, arrived in 1851. He was the first to purchase land there under the Canterbury Association. The property is that now occupied by Mr. Phillips. Captain Mutter built the house. He planted out trees, which are about the oldest of their kind on the peninsula, and have always been remarkable for their growth. With him came Mr. and Mrs. Funnell, Sr., and Mr. and Mrs. Hammond. Captain Mutter had the misfortune of losing nearly all his implements and goods in Littleton. They were put in a boat, which sank after leaving the ship. Commodore Levode also lived in German Bay. Kubler was the name of one of the original settlers who died in the early years. Mr. Wool was the name of a man who has long since left. Messrs. Hempelman and Welch, father of Mr. Thomas Welch of Akaroa, were among the first to take up land in German Bay. Mr. Lebeau, Sr., was the first to start a dairy, and he found a good sale for his produce among the other settlers. Mr. Vekele lived in the bay till 1842. He then married and came to Akaroa, where he built a flour mill on the site of the Chinaman's house. Mr. Breitmeyer was the only original settler who had a family, but most of the others in time married and settled down. Almost as soon as cattle were introduced from Sydney, dairying commenced, on a very small scale at first, each calf being of great value and beef an enormous price. As the land, however, was cleared and sowed down, it became the settlers' chief employment, and with the production of grass seed has remained so to the present day. German Bay was very beautiful when covered in bush, and unlike many other bays has kept its beauty. This is chiefly owing to the early settlers taking care to plant out English trees as the bush was burnt. The willows, which are an important part of the landscape, were grown from slips brought by the emigrants from St. Helena, where they were taken from the tree over Napoleon's grave. End of section 28. Section 29 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Robinson's Bay. This bay received its name from the man who first bought land there. Mr. Robinson was sent down to Akaroa to act as a magistrate by the New Zealand Company, being accompanied by a constable to enforce his authority. This was in 1840. Mr. Robinson bought 100 acres, and the land is that where Mr. Saxton now resides. He never lived in the bay for any length of time. The bay is a large one, and covered with heavy timber as it was then, it was soon seen that a mill would pay there. The early history of Robinson's Bay is the same as that of the other peninsular inlets. Runaway sailors here found a refuge, and lived by pit sawing. It was no difficult matter in those days for sawyers to make 5 or 6 pounds a week, and then not exert themselves very much. The life they led, though lonely, was not an unhappy one. Building a whare in a convenient place by a creek, they stored up a good supply of provisions and necessary tools. They varied their fare, and spun out the quantity by occasional raids on the wild pigs and birds, and they had not far to look for these. When they got a decent cheque, they revisited the haunts of civilization, and after knocking it down, went back and repeated the same process. The Pavetts put up the first sawmill in the bay. Mr. S.C. Farr built it on the same site as that on which the mill afterwards worked by Messrs. Saxton and Williams stood. Mr. Hughes also possessed a mill here about the same time. These mills, however, did not cut much timber. In 1865, Messrs. Saxton and Williams bought the land now occupied by Mr. Saxton. The old mill was found to be in a rather dilapidated state, and not capable of doing much work. The new owners entirely renovated it, employed a great many men, and in a short time produced 1,000,000 feet of timber yearly. The timber was punted out to vessels in the bay. Messrs. Lardner and Sims carried a great deal of it away in their punt. Captain Malcolmson and the well-known Antelope and Mr. E. Latter's vessels, among which were the Foam and the E. and U. Cameron, were kept busily employed. The SS Beautiful Star once took a cargo to Dunedin, and also the SS Wainui. There were a great many vessels employed at different times. Mr. Hughes built the Isabella Jackson on the spot where Mr. Johnston's house now is. The Pavetts built the Thetis on the beach. Nearly all the old settlers now in the bay, and many in different parts of the peninsula, worked for Messrs. Saxton and Williams, 30 hands being employed by the mill. About 50 bullocks were used in dragging the big logs down the hills. The flat, of course, was first cleared, and here 40 acres of hay were annually grown for the bullocks. The house of the Pavards was situated a few yards away from Mr. Saxton's present dwelling. During a bushfire it was burned, and they had to build a whare in the bush. The bushfires at times were very severe, and once the whole bay was in a blaze, the inhabitants having to camp out in the open, close to the beach. Mr. Johnston was one of the earliest settlers in Robinson's Bay. Mr. Barnett of Le Bons also lived here before going over the hills. Mr. Piper of Duvauchelle was in the bay in the first year of its settlement, and Mr. E.S. Chappell was an early inhabitant. Messrs. Whitfield, Duxbury, W.N. MacDonald, deceased, Kingston and Tizard came in a vessel called the Barracuda from the Otago goldfields. Mr. Gundy owned the place now occupied by Dr. Fisher, and was one of the first settlers. Mr. B. de Mermanche rented a large portion of Messrs. Saxton and Williams' land, that principally which was cleared. The Curries and many others came soon after the mill was started. Mr. Johnston, who was bullock driving for the mill owners, and Mr. L. Le Valiant were the first to start dairies. Messrs. Saxton and Williams commenced a dairy which they rented to Mr. B. de Mermanche. On this dairy as many as 80 cows were milked, the buildings being where Mr. Saxton's house now stands. As the land was cleared, the men in employment in the mill bought it up and started dairying. The first sheep were brought into the bay about 20 years ago. Mr. Saxton came out on the ship Westminster in 1858, in which ship also came Mrs. A. Rodriguez, J. Wilkin, and others. Although in the bay that year, he did not settle there till 1865, when he went into partnership with Mr. Williams, and they started the sawmill. The only fatal accident which happened in the bay was that by which a man named Tozer lost his life. He was cross-cutting with Mr. Kingston and was on the lower side. On being sawn through, half of the log rolled on the unfortunate man and crushed him to death. Mr. Tolley, now living in Ashburton, once had his leg broken when turning a log drawn by bullocks. The owners of the mill put up the jetty, which has gone to ruin. They bore all the expense of having it done, besides supplying all the timber. A tramway was laid up to the mill and extended up the valley 3 miles. This saved a great amount of labour, as vessels came and loaded at the jetty, and the nuisance of punting was done away with, besides saving a lot of work with the bullocks. The owners of the mill built a school for the children of the men at work, on the site of Mr. Morgan's house. Afterwards, when Mr. A.C. Knight was Minister of Education, the government bought land and erected the present school. It is not many years ago since all the valuable timber was cut. The old jetty and tramway have gone to ruin, but a new wharf has recently been put up. The mill property is now a sheep station occupied by Mr. Saxton. Dairying is the chief occupation of the settlers in the bay. End of section 29. Section 30 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Duvauchelle's Bay South. Duvauchelle's Bay is not single like the others, but contains 2 distinct valleys, each having its own watershed and separated by a distinct ridge. In this article we propose to treat of that portion nearest Robinson's Bay, all of which, with the exception of a few sections, is occupied by Messrs. Piper Brothers. The name was derived from 2 brothers who held a couple of sections under the Nantes Bordelais Company. They never lived in the bay, and yet it still bears their name. It was never a French settlement at all. The first that is known of it is that Ralpraha had a big cannibal feast just where the tramway crosses the main road. When forming the tramway, Messrs. Piper and Hodgson disinterred many old bones and other relics of these terrible festivities. Messrs. Narby, Jandroit, and others were living in the valley later on, sawing timber. The first section disposed of by the Canterbury Association was one of 200 acres, which they gave on their collapse to Lord Lyttelton, Lord Cavendish, and Lord Charles Simeon in part payment of money advanced to the association. These 200 acres were first held on a nominal lease from Mr. Harman, agent for the nobleman in question, by William Augustus Gordon, brother of the great Chinese Gordon, whose death at Khartoum startled the civilized world. He resided in the bay many years, working sometime for Mr. Piper. He eventually went to Invercargill, where he died. The first land bought under the Canterbury provincial land laws was bought by Messrs. Cooper, Hodgson and Wilson. It was purchased in 1857 and consisted of 50 acres. They were soaring there for some 18 months, and then Mr. Harry Piper made his first purchase in the bay, a 30-acre section where his house now stands. The history of the bay, as all peninsula men know, is intimately connected with the gentleman we have mentioned. He had arrived in Canterbury in July 1852, having come out on the old Summerung with Sir Jonathan Hall, Mr. A.C. Knight, Mr. Wright, chief postmaster at Littleton, Mr. Brown, brewer of Christchurch, and many other old settlers. Mr. Piper came down to the peninsula in November of that year to Mr. T.S. Duncan, the late Crown Solicitor, who was then cockatooing in Decanter Bay. The following May, 1853, he went to Mr. John Hay in Pigeon Bay, and stayed till that gentleman left for home at the end of that year. All the Pavitt family were soaring in Pigeon Bay at that time. There were 7 of them, 3 pairs soaring and 1 man cooking. There was a great flood that autumn, and boats could float where the present road now runs. In those days, Mr. E. Hay had pigs by the 100, which were known by their tails being cut. They were fetched down to feed by blowing a cow horn. Wild pigs were of course distinguished by their long appendages. They were very plentiful, and used to come and feed with the tame ones, and strange to say, the pig dogs, a breed known as Macintoshes, half bull and half kangaroo, when let loose, never touched a short-tailed pig, but always went straight for the wild ones. One day Captain Thomas of the Red Rover, an old skippy, a whaler, saw a big wild boar running from the dogs up the road, and valiantly tried to stop him, but he quickly threw both over on their backs, strange to say without inflicting the slightest scratch. This pig was killed by Mr. Tom White 10 minutes after. To show how bad these wild pigs were, Mr. Turner was stuck up for a long time on the fence at Hayes Corner by a big boar, and a man named Joe Scott, coming round from Sinclair's to Hayes, was stuck up on top of an old sawpit for several hours. After leaving Hayes, Mr. Piper went soaring with Mr. Hillier in Pigeon Bay, and after that went boating with old Skippy, and afterwards soared with Mr. Turner in Pigeon Bay. Mr. James Pawson of Little Akaroa came over to Robinson's Bay to flitch for the Pavitts at the sawmill, and Mr. Piper went mates with him, and then went to Henderson's at the Commercial Hotel Akaroa, where an immense business was then doing. Le Bon's was the next place visited, where he joined Messrs. Cudden and Wilson in a small sawmill, the first erected there, but previously worked by the Cuffs. He afterwards soared for some months with Eugen, the Frenchman, in Radcliffe's Gully, German Bay. Mr. Piper afterwards soared in Pawson's Valley. In 1859, while residing in this place, Mr. Piper was induced by Messrs. Hodgson, Cooper, Wilson and Henderson to join them in erecting a sawmill in Duvauchelle, near his 30-acre section. At first, the speculation was a total failure, owing in great measure to defective engineering. Mr. Henderson then failed, and his 5th was sold to the other 4 proprietors, to whom the late Mr. Robert Heaton Rhodes proved on that occasion a good friend. The first 2 cargoes of timber were lost, owing to demurrage charges caused by Mr. Henderson's failure. Some 3 years after that, Messrs. Piper and Hodgson bought out Messrs. Cooper and Wilson, and became sole proprietors. From this time the mill progressed favourably, and in a few years was improved and altered, the firm going to the expense of over £1,000. The partners had sown down the logging roads, and where the fire had run through the tops, with English grass, and the first cocksfoot Mr. Piper bought was from Mr. George Armstrong, who had purchased it at Wellington, and let a bag go as a favour at £1 a pound. Alas, there is no such price nowadays. It flourished exceedingly, and Mr. Piper sold many tons afterwards at from sixpence to sixpence halfpenny per pound. Indeed, Messrs. Hodgson and Piper and the Messrs. Hay were the principal producers of Coxford in the days of its introduction. In 1874, Mr. Piper bought Mr. Hodgson out, but kept the mill running about 6 years after. Altogether, some 20 million feet of timber were sawn out of the valley, 9/10 of it being totara, and grand totara at that. Mr. Piper purchased the rest of the valley after Mr. Hodgson left, and has since remained sole proprietor, but 18 months ago let the property to his sons, Messrs. Harry and James Piper. Mr. Piper married in June 1859, his wife coming out with Mr. John Hay and the old Caroline Agnes. Mr. Piper was one of the old Peninsula boat's crew who held an unbeaten record of victory for 7 years against all comers, both in Akaroa and Littleton. There were 3 Pawsons and W. Cormack in the Littleton crew, besides Mr. Piper, and one of the Macintoshes pulled an Akaroa. Mr. John Barwick, the well-known and esteemed clerk of the Akaroa and Wainui Road Board, is another resident in this part of Duvauchelle, besides Messrs. Piper. He lives upon one of the original Duvauchelle sections, of which he has been the occupier for many years past. Mr. Lebeau's pretty home is in the corner of the bay. When the mill was in full swing, 40 men were always employed. Clearing was very expensive in those days, the first lot of 70 acres being let to some Maoris for £4 an acre, and a bag of sugar and a pound of tobacco for every 10 acres. Mr. Piper has been associated with the local government bodies since their start. He helped before the road boards were established, and has served well and faithfully both in them and the county council, holding the position of chairman in both bodies. The Duvauchelles of today is a very different place from that of the old times, when the sawmill was first established. Where the mighty tothras once provided a home for thousands of native birds, good succulent grasses nourish stock, which brings wealth to their proprietors and revenue to the colonial government. Many regret the passing away of the old order of things and sentimentalize over the loss of those timbered solitudes where supplejacks were thick and the wild pig luxuriated. But we cannot help fancying that to the thinking person the present landscape is far more gratifying. True, gloomy Rembrandt-like shadows have disappeared, and the tui no longer plumes his jewelled wings on the summit of some forest monarch. But in the stead of the past beauties are smiling slopes of grass, which carry in thousands those gentle friends of man, whose feet are truly said to make golden the soil over which they pass. It must not for a moment be thought that the settlers in Duvauchelles have had no idea of preserving the original loveliness of the valley. A large patch of bush has been saved near the summit, and endeavours have been made to encourage all vegetation sheltering the watercourses, with most satisfactory results. The konini, the tutu, the ribbonwood, and dozens of other aboriginals spread a grateful shade over the waters and lessen evaporation, while giving intense satisfaction to the artistic taste. Nor is this all, for on all sides rise plantations of trees from other countries. Of these, the blue gums have best repaid their growers. In one place on the flat they reach an altitude of at least 100 feet, rising side by side, straight and graceful. The pinus and cygnus has also done well, and the macrocarpa fairly, but the larch does not seem to thrive with that luxuriance which might have been expected from the soil that contains the remains of so many thousands of its giant predecessors. The creek is all protected by willows on its banks, and many other forest trees, including oak, silver poplar, sycamores, and Scotch pines. There is a nice garden and orchard, and a tennis court, which we think will fairly challenge comparison with any on the peninsula. In the future, the bay will be far lovelier than it is now. The old stumps will gradually disappear, and the many old buildings connected with the mill be destroyed, and covered with the sheltering grass, whose silent march conquers so many scars on the bosom of old Mother Earth. Smooth and smiling with a peaceful English look will be the Duvauchelles of our grandchildren. But to those of the present generation, by whom the wilderness was reclaimed, these very stumps have all an interest. From this tree, your guide will say, came all the fluming for the mill. From that, we cut 12,100 feet of 8x1 boards from a single length. To them, each old stump is a reminiscence of a victory of industry, a symbol of honest profit for hard toil, a part of the old peninsular life which has, with its many toils and troubles and pleasures, passed away for ever amongst the things that were. This is a valley which formerly supported a few hundred pigeons and a score or two of wild pigs, most of which were unfit for human consumption, unless under very trying circumstances. The great floods of 1886 did much damage in Duvauchelles. A tremendous slip from the O'Kane's road covered the rich alluvial flat with clay, and the creek brought down boulders and rubbish till the wool shed was threatened, fences covered to the top rail, and much good pasture ruined for the time. Many of the young gum trees died from the lower portion of their trunks being covered, and it will be many years before traces of the disastrous event will be obliterated. End of section 30. Section 31 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Pigeon Bay. Messrs. Hay and Sinclair were the first settlers in this bay. It was in the year 1844, in the month of April, that these gentlemen, leaving their families in Wellington, sailed in a schooner from that port to seek land in the south, where they had heard of fine plains. They had originally left Scotland in 1839, and were going first of all to settle in the north. But the tales they had heard of the Canterbury and Tiree plains made them very anxious to explore them. On arrival at Lyttelton, their first port of call, they did not know the exact locality of the plains, but seeing the hills low at the head of Governor's Bay, they thought that must be the road. Accordingly, they climbed to the saddle of what is now Gebby's Pass, but on arrival they found to their disappointment only what they thought was sea on the other side, which was of course the waters of Lake Ellesmere. They then determined to try for the Tiree, and accordingly sailed for Port Chalmers, and landed up by Anderson's Bay. But they were again unsuccessful, not going far enough to find the level land. They then determined to return north again, and sailed for Pigeon Bay, whither they had been driven by stress of weather on the way down. Here Mr. Sinclair announced his intention of making his home, as he was tired of wandering, and Mr. Hay decided to do the same. It was then agreed that Mr. Sinclair should occupy that part of the bay now known as Holmes Bay, but then as Sinclair's, Mr. Hay taking the main bay itself. They then returned to Wellington and brought down their families and some 4 head of cattle, and farming and other implements, amongst which were a plough and harness. At the time of the landing, Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair had 3 sons and 3 daughters, and Mr. and Mrs. Hay 2 sons, Mrs. James and Thomas Hay, then 3 and 2 years old respectively. The families lived together for nearly 2 years, first in a tent and then in a thatched whare. We may here say that the inducement to settle in Pigeon Bay was that there was a settlement in Akaroa considered likely at that time to become one of the principal in the South Island. Finding they had not enough cattle, Messrs. Hay and Sinclair purchased some from Messrs. B and G Rhodes, for whom Mr. George Rhodes was then managing a run consisting of the land since occupied by Messrs. Armstrong, Rhodes and Haylock. We must not forget to mention that the schooner that brought the Messrs. Hay and Sinclair and their families to Pigeon Bay also brought the Messrs. Deans, Gebbys, Mansons and their families, all these old settlers so well known to our readers arriving at the same date. The cattle did wonderfully well in the bush, there being little clear land except at the points. As may be supposed, the living at those times was very primitive. There was no store nearer than Wellington, and consequently our settlers were sometimes out of flour, sugar, tea, and other things we consider necessary. Their principal meat food was pigeons and wild pork, and occasionally ducks and teal. The pigeons were numberless, the old whalers having given the bay the name it bears from that circumstance. There used to be a good deal of exchange, too, with the whalers, who used to give slops and stores in exchange for vegetables and the beef, which was killed as the cattle increased. About 3 or 4 years after the landing, Mr. Sinclair built a cutter of about 8 or 10 tons, with the intention of taking the produce of the bay to Wellington. When she was completed, she was loaded with all the produce in the bay, the result of a year's labour, and sailed for Wellington. The crew consisted of Mr. Sinclair, his eldest son George, Alfred Wallace, and another young man. Terrible to relate, the cutter never reached Wellington, and nothing was ever heard of her again. It was indeed a severe blow to the new settlers thus to lose the heads of one family, and the whole result of so many months of arduous labour. Mrs. Sinclair was inconsolable, and let the place to Mr. Mackintosh, and went to Wellington. She returned after a time, however, and resided in Akaroa, and then again came to Pigeon Bay, Mr. Mackintosh taking up the bay now known by his name. Eventually, in 1862, she sold out to Mr. George Holmes, and went to the Sandwich Islands, where she recently died at the advanced age of over 90 years. About the beginning of 1851, Messrs. Sinclair and Hay built new houses, the former in Holmes Bay, and the latter where Annandale used to stand. Mr. Sinclair's house was burnt, it will be remembered, only a few years ago. Mr. Hay's house formed the kitchen at Annandale, and was of course destroyed by the slip. Immediately after the Wairoa massacre, the Maoris agreed to murder all the whites in the South Island. They arranged to make fire signals, known as the old Maori telegraph, and begin with killing the Deans at Riccarton, and then the people at Port Levy, Pigeon Bay, Akaroa, and elsewhere. The massacres were all to take place on the same day, and the natives were afterwards all to meet in Akaroa to destroy the whaling settlements. It was a time of great terror, and Mr. Hay hardly knew what to do. However, he determined to remain with his family in the bay and sell his life as dearly as possible. He loaded all his guns and pistols ready, and strange to say, the pistols remained loaded for no less than 21 years. Luckily, the plot was frustrated. First of all, there were among the whalers and settlers men who had Maori wives, and these told their husbands. A chief named Bloody Jack, too, wrote to the chief at Port Levy, telling him that he would be his enemy for life if he touched the whites. There was some hesitation and delay, and eventually the plot was abandoned. The next great event was the arrival of the first 4 ships on the 16th of December, 1851. Need we say our settlers were delighted. Now there was no need to fear the Maoris, and there was a probable near market for produce and the advantages of society. It was indeed a red-letter day, and was duly celebrated. After the founding of the settlement, Mr. Hay had considerable trouble in getting his land secured to him. His original grant was for the North Island, where he had been unable to settle. However, his claims were at last allowed. At this time, Messrs. Cuff, Stewart, Tom White, and a host of other settlers came to the bay, and Messrs. Hunt, Mackay, and others followed. There was a fortnightly mail at that time, and the want of a school began to be keenly felt. Mr. Hay had some private teachers, not, however, of much ability, and then came Mr. Knowles and established the first school. Mr. Gillespie followed, and immensely increased the reputation of the school, and then came Mr. Fitzgerald, and to him came many pupils from Christchurch, and in fact all Canterbury. It was then indeed a most successful enterprise. The gold discoveries of Australia began to have a very beneficial influence at this time. Besides clearing out a great many of the old dissolute sawyers and whalers, it increased the price of produce enormously. Oats went up to 8 shillings a bushel, and potatoes to 8 and 10 pounds per ton, and the settlers thrived. Afterwards the Dunedin diggings broke out, and so prices never got very low for years afterward. The cocksfoot industry on the peninsula was started by Mr. Hay. He gave at the rate of 2 and 6 per pound for the first seed, which he found did wonderfully well in the bay. Soon it spread, and a demand set in, and in 1 year Messrs. Hay Brothers sold no less than 70 tons at 8p per pound. Mr. Hay was never covetous of land. He always wished to see neighbours around him and encouraged them to settle. When he died in 1863, he had only really acquired between 900 and 1,000 acres, but he had the preemptive right over 2,000 more. During the subsequent trusteeship, the estate enormously increased in value and acreage. It was eventually purchased by Messrs. James and Thomas Hay, the eldest sons, from the rest of the family, and is now, as all Canterbury settlers know, one of the finest estates in the colony. Some years ago, however, a great misfortune occurred. On the 18th of August, 1886, a terrible slip came from the hills above the Annandale homestead and utterly overwhelmed it, burying the gatherings, the relics of 40 years, in a sea of mud. Luckily, it happened in the daytime, and there was no loss of life. The bay is one of the best on the peninsula. Its well-managed road board has secured good roads for it. It has been well and thoroughly cleared and grassed, and its future is fully assured, as all can see who visit its many smiling homesteads. The following is an interesting account of an attempt amongst the Maoris to break the tapu in Pigeon Bay in 1853. It appears that late in the year, 2 sealing boats carrying about 25 Maoris and half-castes, amongst which were some very pretty girls, arrived in Pigeon Bay from Dunedin. Most of these settled in the bay, and as a good proportion of the men had been whaling, they were superior in their ideas to the old Maori superstitions, and laughed at the idea of the tapu. A well-known Maori, named Toby, who had been a headsman in whaling boats for many years, took the lead in the movement, and after many a kororo, he and those who doubted the virtue of the tapu resolved to test it by attempting to seize 2 large sealing boats, over which the sacred Maori halo had been thrown, viz., the one from which Bloody Jack had been knocked overboard and drowned whilst trying to land at Timaru, and another owned by the young chief Hapukuku. These 2 boats were each under a bark whare upon the small flat near the present wharf, and the reason for wishing to utilize them was that the natives at that time nearly supplied Lyttelton with firewood and potatoes, which they hawked round from house to house upon their backs, and that these 2 boats would carry quite as much as 5 whaleboats. At this time there were 2 kikes in the bay. Theirs occupied the flat near the wharf, with a population of about 75. The other, Kingston's, was at the head of the bay, with some 150, besides a few at Sinclair's and 4 whares in the gully below the wharf, called Hapukukas. The old natives were quite alive to the proposed sacrilege, and had taken steps to prevent it, and this too in such a manner that the breakdown was an utter surprise. Runners were sent to Kaikoura, north, and to Tumuka, south, taking in the intermediate kikes, with instructions to go to Pigeon Bay at a certain date. In the meantime, the breakers of the tapu had hauled the boats to Gilbert's shed to be repaired and painted. Gilbert did not commence at once, which possibly saved some trouble, but the day of meeting saw some 400 to 500 strangers arrive in hot blood ready to fight for the old custom, and it nearly came to a contest, only the renegades were too few. So that after 3 days feasting, kororoing, and blazing away powder, it was decided to cremate the boats. The boats were hauled to low water, covered with dry scrub and burned, the natives, during the conflagration, doing a cry. Thus ended the largest native gathering on the peninsula since the white man's time. End of section 31. Section 32 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Head of the Bay. Although the bay is called Duvauchelle's and Head of the Bay are often called by each other's name, the bay in which Messrs. Piper, Barwick and Lebeau live is strictly Duvauchelle's. That in which the County Council Office and Post Office is really the Head of the Bay. They are in reality one bay, though 2 distinct valleys run back. Mr. Lebeau was the first white man who lived in Duvauchelle, or head of the bay. He came ashore from a whaler and built a whare on the spot where his son's house now stands. He arrived a year after the French immigrants came out to Akaroa and was the father of the present resident. For many years, the only inhabitants of the head of the bay were a number of sawyers. Many of them afterwards became settlers. Among them were Peter Connolly, Joseph Bruneau, Courtenay Nicholas, Louis Le Valiant, Bernard and his nephew, and James Piper. The timber in the valley was nearly all totara and black pine, white pine growing on the flats close to the seashore. Like the rest of the peninsula, the head of the bay was covered in dense bush, which ran down to the water's edge. Even in those times, when pigs were plentiful all over the country, the head of the bay was famous as literally swarming with them. Many and exciting are the tales told of pig hunts in this locality in the old days by the early settlers. The Pawsons arrived in the bay in 1850 and cut the timber for the public house about to be built. Mr. Pawson Sr. came out to Port Nicholson in 1840, at the same time as Mr. James Wright of Wainui and the Coromandel, after a very stormy passage of 9 months, 6 weeks of which were spent in the Cove of Cork repairing the damage caused by a terrific gale the vessel experienced shortly after commencing the voyage. The family remained in the Wellington province for 9 years, and then left for Lyttelton in the Queen. From Lyttelton they came to Little Akaroa in a ketch commanded by Captain Bruce of Bruce Hotel notoriety. The boat belonged to the Maoris, and was probably the same that Hempelman bought the peninsula from Bloody Jack for. The Pawsons did not live in the head of the bay till 1857. They came over occasionally for a time to cut timber. They saw the fine timber the bay possessed in these visits, and bought a mill from Mr. Bryant in Barry's Bay. The 3 brothers, Messrs. Jonas, John, and William Pawson, worked it together for a number of years, erecting it a good way up the valley, close to the house in which the latter now lives. Mr. John finally bought his 2 brothers out, and worked it himself for a time, afterwards building the big mill at the bottom of the bay. Messrs. Saxton and Williams afterwards bought the mill and worked it very profitably. Mr. Shadbolt, who arrived about the year 1855, was the last owner of the mill, taking it and cutting out all the timber in the bay. Nearly all the old settlers about the head of the bay were employed in those times at this mill, and a great quantity of timber was cut annually. The vessels that took away this timber were all built in the bay. Mr. Robert Close first started a boat-building yard, close to where the jetty had been built. He built the vessels Sylph, Sea Devil, and others. The latter is very likely the boat afterwards owned by Mr. Thacker, which came to grief in Little O'Kane's. Messrs. Barwick and Wilson afterwards opened a yard in Duvauchelle. They had come to the colony from Tasmania. Mr. Barwick is by trade a shipbuilder, spending 9 years at it, the earlier portion at Sunderland and afterwards at London. The partners, before coming to the head of the bay, had built the vessel Foam at Redhouse Bay. At Duvauchelle they built the vessels Vixen, Breeze, Spray, Dart, and the Wainui, afterwards converted to a steamer. They also built the first 3 boats for Timaru lighterage. The Spray is the only one of these vessels that is now heard of. Messrs. Barwick and Wilson dissolved partnership when they had built these vessels for Mr. E. C. Latter, and Mr. Barwick worked the yard himself for 2 years. During that time he built a large punt, which was afterwards turned into the ketch Alice Jane, that is so well known all over the peninsula. Mr. Wilson was a very peculiar character, being very mean and scraping together all he possibly could, and very generous in distributing it, giving the shirt off his back, as one who knew him well puts it, to the first man who asked him. He was the first man to open a store in the bay, but it did not prove very profitable to him, as he gave away most of his goods. While Messrs. Barwick and Wilson worked the shipyard, they employed over 30 men. After working the yard by himself for 2 years, Mr. Barwick gave it up as there was no work to be done, nearly all the timber in the bay being cut. Bushfires were pretty common in those early days. At the time, the whole peninsula was on fire, starting from Pigeon Bay. The whole of the bush in the head of the bay was killed, and the fire, bursting out afresh at intervals, was burning from January to May. The settlers in the bay have been very fortunate, as there have never been a fatal accident there, the only serious one remembered being that by which a man lost his legs through having them crushed under a tree when he was bush-falling. The public house was first owned by Messrs. Tribe and Selig. Afterwards Mr. Pawson Senior became owner, and Mr. John Anderson took it from him. Mr. Shadbolt then bought it. Messrs. Vanstone, Barker and Brooks each managed the hotel after this, Mr. Shadbolt taking charge of it again when they had left it. Mr. Cooper had it after it was rebuilt, after being burnt down during the ever-memorable hotel burning period. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson now rule there most worthily. During the early years in the history of the bay, the want of a school was much felt, for there were many children in the bay belonging to men working at the mill, and a place of worship was also much needed. Lord Lyttelton therefore gave half an acre for the purpose, and the men clubbed together and gave timber and work until they had erected a suitable building. The half-acre is that on which the church now stands, though it has been rebuilt. The Akaroa and Wainui Road Board was shifted from Akaroa to the head of the bay in 1878. The office stood where the courthouse now is. The permanent road to Little Akaroa from the bay was made about 1864. At the same time, the road from Akaroa to Christchurch was made up Red John's Gully. The evidence of the board's usefulness is visible everywhere, and the bay is perhaps the most central position where its headquarters could be situated. The county council offices were built in 1879, and the post and telegraph office in the same year. Messrs. Barker, father of Mr. Beelby Barker, and Fry established the line of coaches running from Christchurch and Pigeon Bay to Akaroa. Mr. S. Lee has owned the business for some considerable time. During the last few years, communication with Christchurch has been considerably facilitated, and until the railway touches on Akaroa Harbour, it is unlikely that we shall be able to reach the capital of the province in a shorter time than we can at present. End of section 32. Section 33 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Island Bay. There are interesting associations of the past in this bay, lying as it does over that rugged coast between Peraki and Land's End, as the west head of the harbour is called. It receives its name from a towering rock guarding the entrance, and rising up out of the troubled waters like an old castle. The bay is lonely and deserted, and the traces of those who lived there long ago are fast disappearing. It is open to the southwest, and heavy seas roll in there at times, as the cave-worn sides and the heaps of smooth boulders on the beach testify well. Island Bay was inhabited by whalers in the early days, these brave men who lived hard lives and thought danger a pleasure. Since the whales left the coast, the bay has been deserted and lonely. The Maoris had a pa here. Traces of their stone walls and huts are still to be seen, and greenstone to be found. The writer picked up a small chisel of this substance, and many handsome implements formed of it have been discovered from time to time. These Maoris, in fact all of them along this coast, were a wild race. Horrible stories are told of their cannibalism, and some of the white men earliest in the bays have witnessed their ungodly feasts. When the Maoris wanted to settle a quarrel, they went about it in quite a business-like manner. Over they went to Wakamoa, the next bay towards the heads, and after they had had enough and buried their dead, came home. The ridges, graves of many a stalwart warrior, are conspicuous yet. The natives living in Island Bay had a fine natural fortress, for it was almost impregnable. Thick, heavy bush behind, steep walls on either side, for it is quite a steep climb into the bay, and a beach on which it is comfortable to land only when the weather is fine. A slip while climbing the rocky sides would be dangerous. A story is told of a Maori woman who was collecting firewood on the spur. She tied a bundle to her back and commenced to descend. Slipping, she rolled from the top to the bottom, and little life was left in her when she stopped rolling. The cheese from Mr. MacPhail's dairy, before the road was made, was carried down on men's backs to the beach. However they did it is a puzzle, and a very few trips up and down would satisfy an ordinary Hercules. When climbing the side, and thinking of it, one fancies that it would have been a great temptation to let them roll in spite of all consequences. The bay, however, is little visited, except by the cattle on the runs. There is a fine creek running down the valley, though on the tops of the spurs the land is very parched in summer. About 1840 whaling stations were established all along the coast, at Ikaraki, Peraki, Ōnawe, and Island Bay. Whales were plentiful at that time, and there was always plenty of employment for the boats of the whalers. 2 large boilers set in stone are still in the bay, and there were others which have disappeared. There is also an arrangement for hauling the whales on shore, fixed on the same principle as the capstan of a ship. Heaps of whalebone litter the beach and the sides of the creek. A great quantity of it has, it is said, been carried away to bone dust factories. Staves of innumerable casks are piled up round the boilers. One can imagine the wild scene the bay presented on some dark night from the sea, when the whalers were busy boiling down, the fires blazing up and showing their forms distinctly against the background of heavy bush. The stormy seas, which frequently roll into the bay, show signs of having been far up the creek, where lie embedded great pieces of whalebone. Messrs. W. Green, after whom Green's Point is named, C. Brown and Hall were the first owners of the Island Bay fishery. After leaving the station, Charlie Brown went away in a whaling vessel, never afterwards heard of, and supposed to have been wrecked on the coast. Hall left Akaroa one day in a whaleboat with a quantity of provisions for the bay. The boat and its crew were never seen again. It is supposed that they got fast to a whale and were capsized, as the last time the boat was seen, it was close to one that was spouting about the head of the harbour. The next owner of the fishery was Mr. George Rhodes, brother of Mr. Robert Rhodes. Samuel Williams, commonly known as Yankee Sam, whaled for him. When the gold diggings broke out in Melbourne, he went there. Mr. James Wright, the hearty old Baron of Wakamoa, got the trypots from him, and whaled there until the persecuted whales left these waters to seek some quieter home. At times, when a school of whales appeared, the whole coast was very busy. About 30 boats were often out. Casks were bought at Lyttelton, and when filled at the bay were sent back again in small vessels. The Maoris were employed on the stations. Some of them were expert whalers. No wrecks have actually occurred in Island Bay itself. A brig was lost between it and Land's End some years ago, and all hands drowned. She was laden with timber, great quantities of it floating up Akaroa harbour. Snufflenose, where the ill-fated Clyde was lost, is a little way round the coast towards Peraki. It is believed that other vessels have met their fate on this point, as wreckage has been found from time to time. There would be little hope for mariners whose vessel dashed on the rocks under those cliffs on a wild night, for the wind blows with terrific force into the bight, and it has been supposed that a current sets into it from the open ocean, so that the danger was fearful indeed before the lighthouse was erected. The spurs slope gently down from the tragic Bossu, connected with so many weird disappearances and mysterious horrors. The extent of the country on that side of the hills surprises one who has just come up the steep side that rises from the harbour. There is much ploughable land there, thousands of acres, and all of the settlers in those parts grow their fields of oats and vegetables in ploughed land. The residents in Island Bay are Messrs. James Wright, McPhail, Neblett, and Randall. The property formerly occupied by Mr. A. C. Knight is now farmed by Mr. Randall. The Baron of Wakamoa was the first to settle in the bay. After him came Mr. J. McKinnon, who lived on the property now owned by Mr. McPhail. Mr. H. Niblett was next, and Mr. Randall arrived recently. The land is very valuable for dairying purposes and for pasturing sheep and cattle. The settlers now have a road as good as any on the peninsula, and the difficult labour of shipping from the bay is done away with, as they can easily cart their produce to Wainui. It was to Mr. McPhail's house the survivor of the Clyde came, that being the nearest to the scene of the catastrophe. The view from Mount Bossu is a grand one, On one side the harbour, on the other the bight, across which are seen the snow-clad Alps, and terminating the coast, the waters of Ellesmere. There are many picturesque spots in the bay, and the bracing winds from the open ocean make it a healthy place. There is a waterfall close to Island Bay, 200 feet high, which is a grand sight. End of section 33. Section 34 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Little River. Little River was one of the latest settled portions of the peninsula, although it is one of the most important places now. It is the outlet from the harbour to the plains, and all of the bay roads converge towards it. The settlement, consisting as it does of large valleys and fertile flats, well watered, was, it is not difficult to perceive even now, covered in dense bush. Since the mills have been at work, it has been a lively go-ahead place. There is still a large quantity of timber to be cut, but year by year the bush is disappearing. When it is gone, the chief export from the place ceasing, Little River will have to depend upon its grazing and its cocksfooting, and as there is such a large area suitable for dairying purposes, the export of cheese from the peninsula will be largely increased when the bushland is cut up into dairy farms. The Maoris in the early times had a pa at the mouth of the Little River. Tikawila, or a person of some such name, was the chief. These Maoris obtained their food supplies from where Little River now is, hunting the wild pigs and killing the wild birds. Little River was famous for its birds. The traveller through it in former years was always enchanted by the songs, scarcely ever ceasing, of the denizens of the bush. It was also a most beautiful place, prettier than it is now, and some of the largest trees on the peninsula grew there. The Maoris were rich in provisions, for the river and lake swarmed with tunas and other native fish. When Raupraha came down with his warriors, he sent some of his men over to Little River, but hearing of their approach, the natives did not await their arrival, but left their home for a time. It has always been, however, the district where the Maoris were in the greatest number. A great many still live there, are on terms of equality with the European settlers, and own much of the best land about there. The Maoris annually grow large patches of kumaras on the hills above Harmon's Bush. Mr. Price was in Kaiapoi as early as 1831. Shortly afterwards he was whaling along the peninsula bays, and while at Ikaraki came over to Little River. Seeing the excellent timber there, he set 2 pairs of sawyers at work in 1840. The whalers at the stations in the bays about Peraki often came over to the river, either walking over the hills or sailing round to the outlet of Lake Forsyth into the sea. Messrs. Smith and Robinson, the latter of whom was the first magistrate in Akaroa, owned that property now belonging to Mr. H.D. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan's father came over from Ikaraki and bought them out, Smith going to Australia. This was about 1850. Mr. Birdling also came from the fisheries and bought up land about the river, forming that grand property now possessed by him, and from which some of the best stock in New Zealand is sent to the Addington market. There was a great deal of soaring done in Little River in the old times, a great many runaway sailors from the whaling vessels around the coast congregating there. The lower flats were covered with tutu, Maori cabbage and other vegetation, and it was difficult travelling to reach the valley. William Wood, commonly known as Paddy Wood, who started the Ohaus whaling station, was in Little River early and had land there. Messrs. White and Coop were the first to start the sawmill. The old building is still to be seen just opposite the railway station. To start a sawmill there was a much more difficult matter then than could be considered possible now. The engine was dragged from Christchurch by bullocks, and a great undertaking it was. When the mill was fixed up, there was no lack of material for it to work on. A tramway was made to Lake Forsyth. This carried the timber which was punted over the small lake to Birdling's Flat. Here it was put on another tramway and conveyed to Lake Ellesmere, over which it was taken in punts and crafts to Hart's Creek, Leaston. At one time there were several vessels employed on the lake for this purpose. A steamer also was built at Stony Point. There is very little left now to remind one of these doings. A jetty is still standing, which runs to Lake Forsyth, where the Christchurch Regatta is now held. The tramway has disappeared. The timber had to undergo a lot of handling, but its scarcity and the good price then ruling justified the labour. As may be supposed, a great many men were at work in connection with this bill, and these with their families settled the place. A school was built for their children close to where the Forsyth Arms Hotel now is. There was another school built at Stony Point, of which Mr. Dowling was master. The house now belongs to Mr. Birdling. About 30 years ago, the road from Christchurch to Little River was made by Messrs. Radford, Buckingham and Edmonds. Before this, travelling was guesswork, and those who wished to go to Little River travelled round the points and over the lake flats, making the journey much longer than it is now. The first dairies started in Little River were those of Messrs. Stanbury and G.W. Joblin. These dairies supplied the men working at the timber, and were very profitable then. As the bush was cleared, the land was sown down and cocksfoot cut. As soon as the railway line was made to Birdling's Flat, the Terawera sawmill was started, and is still doing a lot of work. The Western Valley Mill was started some years ago, but has now completed its work. Mr. Stanbury made the road over the hill into the harbour. Little River has a road board of its own, and it has charge of a large district. The new school was built about 1880, and the English church before that, also the Maori church on the Maori Reserve. Both of these churches were prettily situated at the top of small hills, and are very picturesque. The Maori Hall, a commodious building, was erected in 1885, and is a great boon to the settlement, for here public amusements can take place. Formerly, the inhabitants were badly off in this respect. The Forsyth Arms Hotel was built many years ago, and it was unfortunate for travellers that it was not built nearer the spot where the railway ends. The horrible murder which took place at this hotel will be long remembered. The settlement of Little River has been a quiet one, and unfruitful of startling events. It has been a history of quiet prosperity. Some day, perhaps, the railway will be extended to the foot of the hill, and the tunnel bored to the harbour, tapping the peninsula. Little River has a prosperous future before it, and in time it will be like the rest of the peninsula, a collection of fine farms, whose export will be cocksfoot, butter and cheese. End of section 34. Section 35 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Chateris Bay. Perhaps the most picturesque of the bays on Littleton Harbour is that known as Chateris. It is so called from the surveyor who originally measured its area. It is of very considerable extent. Separated by a spur from the head of Littleton Harbour, it is in reality the valley of Mount Herbert, the highest peak of our peninsula, whose giant summits are far loftier than those famed heights of which Macaulay sang in his glorious verses that tell of the fiery warning that flashed through England when the Armada was seen approaching. As seen from the bay, Mount Herbert has two great peaks. The one of greatest altitude is smooth to the summit, and towers in calm serenity over a frowning rocky peak, which at the first glance appears the real monarch, but is in reality some 200 feet lower. The saddle between these two is really the commencement of Chateris Bay, and from the very topmost tier of the hard rocks that crown the latter gushes the spring that is the source of the large creek which finds its way into the harbour in the centre of the bay. It is said this spring is so near the peak that a very little work would cause it to flow in the opposite direction. However, after a somewhat precipitous course, it reaches the head of a beautiful valley some 3 miles in length, along which it runs to the sea, forming many a cool pool and miniature waterfall in its fertilizing progress. Halfway down the valley its course is confined within rather narrow limits by a great barrier of volcanic rock that almost closes the upper flats from those below. Very little labour indeed would make this a stronghold, such as Blackmore tells us of in Lorna Doone, a place where, in the days gone by, a stately dame could in perfect safety dish up those storied spurs which warned her husband and sons that it was time to proceed on another cattle-stealing expedition. From this point the valley rapidly extends in width, and is exceptionally fertile and well grassed. The floods of a few years ago did considerable damage, bringing down great masses of shingle and widening the bed of the creek very greatly. But year by year the soil is gathering over the stones, and the grass is creeping over their grey sides, so that before long the emerald carpet will be as wide as ever. The creek is not untenanted. Besides the eels, the trout that have been placed there have thriven, and in cool pools at the end of rapids can be seen gliding in the clear water. At the end of one spur that embraces the bay, that on the Pūrau side, is a magnificent pinnacle of rock. It is fitly denominated Castle Peak, and so strong is the resemblance of ruined towers that were it on the Rhine, it would doubtless furnish many a tale to an imaginative guide. These hillsides show no traces of having ever been entirely clothed with a forest primeval, but in nooks of the mountain are many patches of kowhai, ngaio, matapo, and other beautiful native trees that flourish exceedingly in these sheltered recesses. No part of the peninsula can be more beautiful than Chateris Bay when we saw it last, in an autumn sunset. The great rocks that cast no shadow here in a thirsty land, but hoard their liquid treasures to their summits, frowned in the deep purple of imperial majesty, and 1,000 various shades flickered and faded over brown hillside and bright green valley, till a sombre haze shrouded all in the soft greys of approaching night. It was Dr. Moore to whom fate allotted Chateris Bay when the sections were drawn for in England, and he came out to Lyttelton in the Sir James Pollock in 1851. He had neighbours on both sides, for the late Mr. Manson, Mr. Gebbie, and their families had settled at the head of the bay in 1845, and Mr. Fleming was located at Port Levy, and Mr. Rhodes at Pūrau. Dr. Moore brought some good cattle out with him, and it was in Chateris Bay that the nucleus of those peninsular herds, which afterwards became so famous for their production of butter, cheese, and beef, were first reared. Brother Phil, Cranberry, His Honour, and General Wolfe among the bulls, and Flash, Duchess, Creamy, and an Alderney named Dunny amongst the cows, were household words amongst the peninsular pioneers. And for a long time no female scion of the famous herd found its way into other hands. But has not this been already recorded in the stories of the peninsula by Reverend R. Bradley? There was another owner of property in the bay, a Mr. Rao. He had a section in the early days, but went away and was heard of no more. 5 or 6 years ago, however, news came he had been living in Victoria, where he had prospered, and Mr. Helmore, a Christchurch lawyer, took possession of the property as his attorney. Dr. Moore did not make a permanent home in Chateris Bay, and sold his property to the Reverend R. Bradley in 1858. Mr. Bradley was clergyman at Papanui before this, and after he became a farmer, he preached at Pūrau on alternate Sundays for 7 consecutive years. Dr. Moore, after the sale, returned to England, where he had many connections, his father having been the mayor of Salisbury. From October 1858 to his death, a period of more than 33 years, the Reverend R. Bradley resided at Chateris Bay with his family, and the principal part of it, some 2,000 acres, was in his possession. A great part was once owned by the late Mr. Manson, but he disposed of it, finding he had too large an area to manage. There are a few small settlers in the bay, the Simpsons and Hayes, and very comfortable little homesteads they have, and lead happy and contented lives. The old buildings erected by Dr. Moore are still standing. In fact, he built the house in which the Bradleys now reside, though of course it has been repaired and altered. He also had a stone dairy and stalls, but these are fast falling into decay. The house is pleasantly situated on rising land about half a mile from the beach. In front is a fine view of the bay, Rabbit Island, and the long peninsula which nearly joins it, and so much reminds one of Ōnawe in Akaroa harbour. In the foreground are newly grassed paddocks, a few stately trees, the pretty homestead of Mr. Hay, and the school buildings, which are very neat. At the back of the house is a splendid plantation of gums, with here and there a Pinus insignis and a macrocarpa. In the bank at the back a cellar has been dug out, and very cool it is in the hottest weather. A neat macrocarpa fence bounds the flower garden, which is rich in many flowers. The roses look particularly nice, and amongst the native shrubs and trees are specially to be noted some grand specimens of the mountain palm, the giant cabbage tree, which here flourishes most luxuriantly. Winding down the path to the left, past the garden, we come to the stockyard, which is very massively fenced and paved with stones. The stables are most spacious and excellent, as might be supposed from their being under the management of Mr. Orton Bradley, the present owner of the estate. End of section 35. Section 36 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Gough's Bay. The lower part of this beautiful bay was the property of the Messrs. Masefield brothers when the first edition of Stories of Banks Peninsula was published, but it now belongs to Mr. V. Masefield, Mr. William Masefield having gone to the Sounds. The native name of the bay is Okururu, and the Messrs. Masefield quite agreed with the writer that it is a great pity the Maori appellation was ever altered. It appears that the present designation was given to it from a man named Gough, who lived there for many years among the natives. These northeast bays were amongst the last settled on the peninsula, owing to the difficulty of access, and of getting away stock or shipping produce. This was so particularly the case with Okururu, that during that great Kaihoanga, or Eat Relation feud, many Maoris fled there in hopes of escaping the visits of their enemies by seeking a locality, the paths to which were almost inaccessible and known to but few. Enterprising Europeans, however, soon ascertained the exceeding richness of the soil, and a French settler named Monsieur Gough purchased a section on the flat, and sent Monsieur Peter Malmonge there to occupy it, and took some cattle over. The difficulty of landing, however, on the Gough's Bay beach was proved in this case, for the boat conveying Monsieur Malmonge and his things was capsized in the surf, and although all hands landed safely, a large box containing his wife's clothes and some other things went to sea. Monsieur Malmonge was in despair, but next morning, on visiting the shore, he was delighted to see the box high and dry on the sand. His spirits immediately revived, and he ran towards it. But what was his horror to find it was merely a shell, for the treacherous ocean had dashed out the bottom, and the valuable contents were, alas, full fathom 5. Peter Malmonge lived there some time, but a mysterious accident occurred, which for a period gave the bay an evil reputation. One night he retired to rest as usual, but when his wife awoke in the morning he was missing, and after a long search he was found by her in the bush, some distance from the house, in an insensible condition. There was a fearful wound on his head, and by his side was an axe covered with blood and hair. It was with great difficulty his life was saved, but when he recovered he could throw no light on the matter, always declaring he remembered nothing from the time he retired to rest till he recovered consciousness after the accident. Investigations were attempted, but the matter remains a mystery to this day. He returned to the bay after the accident, and the whare got the reputation of being bewitched. The most mysterious and appalling noises were heard in the night, and are testified to by many persons above suspicion. On one occasion, Peter Malmonge nearly met with another accident that would probably have proved more disastrous than its predecessor, for one night, after being terribly annoyed by a succession of these mysterious and unaccountable noises, Mr. William Masefield took down a gun and vowed he would shoot anything he saw in the neighbourhood of the house. Opening the door, he observed a dim figure near the phare, and taking aim, had his finger on the trigger, when a loud cooey caused him to stop, and he found it was Peter Malmonche, who had walked over from Akaroa. It is thought that these strange sounds must have been the work of persons who were anxious to prevent the Messrs. Masefield settling, but if so, the fraud was very skilfully devised and carried out, for to this day there is no clue to the mystery. It was in company with Harry Head that Mr. V.V. Masefield first explored the valley. Harry Head then lived at Waikarekikari, and at that place the Messrs. Masefield bought some sections. Harry Head's wonderful powers of finding his way through the bush made him a splendid companion, and on exploring Gough's Bay Valley and finding how fertile it was, Mr. Masefield determined to have it, and the brothers then commenced purchasing it. They exchanged the sections at Waikarekikari with Mr. John Smith for some land he had purchased in Gough's Bay, and the owners of the sections bought by Messieurs Guin and Boreau disposed of them, so that gradually an estate of 1,200 acres was formed, containing some of the best land on the peninsula. This land is divided into 4 paddocks of about 300 acres each, and there are several smaller enclosures for working the sheep easily. Besides an excellent dwelling house, there is a large woolshed, excellent yards, and all the other usual appliances of successful sheep farming. Of course there is a dairy, and speaking of this, when the Messrs. Masefield first went to the bay, they had cattle on the place, and a nice job they used to have with them, for the bay was then, of course, all bush, and it was a terrible worry to get the cattle out, for horses could not be used in such country. To hear the marvellous adventures of one snail-horned bullock that would persist in preferring Gough's Bay to the west coast is enough to make one's hair stand on end. But it is satisfactory to know that after all his extraordinary capers, he eventually gladdened the hearts and stomachs of the Hokitika miners. The house is a comparatively new one, the former erection, in which the mysterious noises used to be so prevalent, having been burnt down. This fire had a nearly fatal termination. The origin was unknown, but Mr. Valentine Masefield, awaking one night, discovered the place was burning. He made for the outer door and got it open, and then called to Mr. W. Masefield, who was sleeping in another room. The door was fastened on the inside, and no doubt was jammed. Mr. W. Masefield, after trying it, was obliged by the smoke to retreat to his bed, where he threw himself down, expecting to be suffocated. Mr. V. Masefield, however, never lost his presence of mind, but running to the outside window, he broke the panes of glass and tore out this part of the sash by main strength. The fresh air rushing in revived his brother, and he came to the window, and somehow was dragged through, badly burned, but safe. It was only just in time, for 5 minutes later the house fell in, one great mass of flame. There is a clump of ngayos and other native scrub at the back of the house, and a few gums planted amongst them have grown wonderfully well. Going to the beach, which is 1/2 mile from the house, one skirts a beautiful piece of bush that Messrs. Masefield have left for ornamental purposes. These gentlemen deserve the thanks of all lovers of nature for the care they have exercised in this respect. Every here and there, groups of the finest trees have been left, which add to the beauty of the scene, afford shelter to the stock, and 1,000 times repay the grazing value of the land they cover. Barbarous vandalism and a desperate greed for every blade of grass has spoiled the beauty of many a peninsular home, and the efforts that are now being made to raise plantations of pinus and cygnus and other trees show what a wise thing it would have been to have spared a few patches of that unrivalled native bush that, once destroyed, no art can replace. The creek is crossed by a bridge of a very long single span, the great Kofi stringers of which show their elasticity as well as their strength as one passes over. The road is that by which the wool and grass seed is taken to the shipping place and winds round the base of the hills. There is sand on the borders of the creek. It is a black sand, like that of Taranaki, and is full of metal, which can easily be separated from it by washing. A little out of the road is an interesting ngaio tree, on which a disappointed Maori ended his troubles not many years ago. It appears that he swung grimly in the air like an old highwayman on a heath for many a day, but that at last his friends scooped a deep hole in the ground beneath the tree, and severing the rope by which he was suspended, let him fall into it. These bones, however, were not destined to rest for long, for a medical gentleman of Akaroa wanted a good skeleton, and hearing of this, disinterred it and carried it away in triumph. Maori bones are common in Goughs, and the sitting-room was once decorated with the bleached skulls and huge femurs of two grim old warriors, the desecration of whose remains in Kaihuanga times might doubtless have caused 1,000 deaths. The tapu surrounding them, however, has now lost its power, and the little hands of children have turned into playthings these mouldering frames of mouths and eyes, from which many an order for death and many a glance of hatred may have issued. After passing this dual tree, one comes to where a wooded valley gives birth to a creek, which here joins the main one. At the junction of the creeks grow a number of wild potatoes. Year after year they spring up with great luxuriance, and when I saw them were in full flower and doubtless had huge tubers underneath. It must be the site of an old Maori garden, and the sandy soil be peculiarly favourable for the growth of the tuber. Here is a sawmill, which has now been busy for some years, cutting the totara, matai, and kahikatea, which abound on the tableland above, known as Crown Island Gully. It originally belonged to Monsieur B. Marmonche, but is now in the hands of a company. Past the mill we come to a pathway hewn out of the rock and leading to the shipping place. It cost some £150 to form this short rocky track and put down the tramway and erect the crane. It was hard work, but it has answered well, for a steamer can now come in to within a few chains of the place where the produce is lowered into the boat, and besides that, shipping can always go on except in southerly weather. The scene here is very grand. A great flat rock partially protects the haven where the boats are loaded, and against this the sea breaks in most imposing waves. There are some curious caves in these rocks, and one goes right through the cliff. It was through this that Mr. W. Masefield once came after a rather dangerous swim. Mr. Pilliet said no man could swim through the surf, and one day, when a nasty sea was rolling and Mr. Adams was present, he resolved to prove to the contrary. He got through the surf all right, but the drawback was too strong for him to return, and finding he was getting exhausted, he made for some flat rocks outside the heads. And thence, by climbing and swimming, he reached the other side of the cavern, and watching his chance, came through. Those who have seen the place can alone realize the difficulty of the feat. On another occasion he swam off to the Red Rover, which was coming in to take away cheese and bacon. It was blowing hard from the southeast, and he remained on board all night. The Red Rover was then undecked, and they had to lay all night in the cold, covered over with what they could get. Next day, in spite of the gale, he swam ashore, and in a lull in the wind some produce was got aboard and some stores landed. Crossing the creek, one can visit the site of the old Maori pa. It is of large extent, and it is said some 700 natives once lived there. The sea must have encroached a good deal on the land here, for the waves reach where some of the whares formerly stood. But a peculiar grass, sown and cared for by Mr. V. Masefield, has checked the encroachment of the sea. The earthworks surrounding the pa are still easily traced. They enclose a space fully 2 acres in extent, and this is again subdivided. An immense amount of work must have been done, and the side of the hill on the south shows traces of having been cultivated from base to summit. Heaps of the bones of fish, dogs, seals, and other animals testify to the enormous feasts once held here, and when the Messrs. Masefield first went there, the poles on which fish were stretched to dry were still standing. At every step, sharpening stones, pieces of greenstone, stones ground into implements, and other curiosities can be found in the sand. A great cedar log was washed ashore here, and is inscribed with many initials from visitors. The stern of the crest was dashed on these sands, and parts of the vessels wrecked at Timaru. The limb of the ngaio tree on which the Maori hung himself is a part of the boat used for shipping, and the piece of the crest is a part of the dairy. A few Maoris were living here to within 20 years ago. Some 10 years before this, the natives then residing there purchased a boat of a man named Howland, living in O'Kane's. The boat was principally putty and paint, and proved a terrible bargain to the unfortunate purchasers. One day, all the resident Maoris, with the exception of 3 women, went out in this boat to fish on the bank, which is some 2 or 3 miles out to sea. They caught a great number of huge hapuka, and these, flapping about in the boat, soon opened a number of leaks, and she sunk, and not a soul was saved. The unfortunate women, whose husbands were aboard, saw the catastrophe from the cliffs, but were powerless to aid. They refused to quit the spot, however, and go to Onuku, though repeatedly urged, saying that they would remain to bury the bones of their husbands when they came ashore. Many a weary year they waited, but the bones never came, and at last one of the faithful creatures died, and the others were then removed by force by the other natives. When their friends were drowned, these women took all their valuables, placed them in 2 canoes, and buried them in the creek. They never divulged the secret of the hiding place, and though the Maoris from Akaroa have spent many a day in endeavouring to discover them, their efforts have been unsuccessful. Some day, perhaps, the wind and its freaks will lay them bare, and then what a host of Maori relics will reward the finder. Speaking of canoes, this was once a great place for them, and the best totorus all through the bush have been felled to construct them. One just finished is still to be seen at the top of a lofty ridge in the middle of the dense bush, and there is another commenced on the Waikirikikari side. Think of the immense labour it must have cost to get these vessels down after the tedious work of making them with fire and stones. No white man would have dreamed of such an undertaking. The old landing place was under the south head. Here it was only possible to ship in very calm southerly weather, and even then it was very dangerous. There is a great cave here under the cliff, and at the time of our visit a grand king penguin occupied a ledge in it, and blinked at us as we lay watching the waves roll in. There is a curious cleft in the cliff here, about 15 feet above the level, and one day, curious to find what it contained, the Messrs. Masefield took down a ladder and inspected it. Inside, within the once warm folds of a cloak of pigeon's feathers, lay the mouldering bones of a little child. How many years have passed since tender hands had reverently placed it in this remote situation? The view from this place is remarkably fine. The bold cliffs of the northern head, which rise 600 feet sheer from the sea, the many rocks in the bay against which the waves dash sheets of foam, the southern head with its 400 feet of overhanging rock, and inland the peaceful valley and gentle spurs with patches of bush here and there, and above all the great peaks of the main range, formed together a most imposing picture, and it was with regret that I turned my steps towards the house. Going back on the south bank of the creek, through the flat, no one can help noticing the extraordinary growth of grass. All the posts in the 60-acre paddock you go through come from one great totara tree, and there were some left over. The walk up the valley is very delightful, the trees being of exceptional beauty. There are a great number of Nico palms, and a curious kind of broadleaf growing there which I have never seen before. It takes root in the forks of the big pines, and gradually grows down till it reaches the earth, where it roots, and gaining fresh strength, gradually embraces and strangles the tree like the rata. It is very beautiful, its leaves being larger and brighter than those of the common broadleaf. The Messrs. Masefield turned out turkeys and geese in the valley. 3 of each were turned out. The turkeys increased so fast that in a few years there were hundreds, but of late they seem to be declining in numbers. We saw several healthy broods. The geese have always done wonderfully well, and there is a great flock of them. The native birds are still numerous, but the carkers and pigeons have disappeared. Mr. V. Masefield does not believe that these birds have been shot out, but that they have migrated to the west coast. He says that the carkers disappeared in a very short time, that 1 month there were thousands, and the next none, so they cannot have been destroyed, but must have sought some other locality. Gough's Bay was once the home of innumerable wekas. For some years Every tussock and every piece of bush was thick with them, and the dogs used to kill as many as 20 a day. A few years ago these also took their departure. From making inquiries, Mr. Masefield traced the arrival of these birds. They came in one immense line from the west, round Lake Ellesmere, and their course to the east must have been stopped by the sea at Gough's Bay. The red-headed parakeets also suddenly disappeared. There were some of the native rats 9 or 10 years ago. They were fond of living in the trees, and one was caught in the fork of a tree as was being felled. The Norwegians, however, have since appeared, and the natives seem to be extinct. The other residents in the bay are Messrs. George Kearney and Jules Lelivre. Both have fine properties stretching from the end of the flat to the summit of the range. In the years to come, we have little doubt that all these gentlemen will have many tenants, and that this beautiful bay, as in the days of old, will support a large population. End of section 36. Section 37 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Peraki. Very beautiful is the head of the Peraki Valley. Thick bush spreads out just below the summit, and here were still to be found, a very few years ago, the wild pigs in considerable numbers. Here also was one of the last haunts of the native pigeon, and the mokomokos, tuis, and other birds swarm in thousands. The track winds on the left-hand side of the gully going down, and crosses the first tongue of bush running out to the tussocked peaks pretty near the summit. In making this road, a strange thing occurred. Though the track was cut through the virgin bush, where none had been known to go before, the largest tree at the creek crossing, a large broadleaf, was found to have been carved with the letters L-Y-A-R. The gully was thereupon called after the lady who was then Miss Lucy Aylmer, and it bears her name on the government maps to this day. The hills on the right-hand side of the valley are very steep in places, and there is one great beetling crag that overlooks the valley, out of which springs a marvellous stone steeple, a splinter formed by some convulsion of nature into an exceptional shape. Above this again towers the Devil's Gap, a great double rock, between the pinnacles of which the road to Little River passes. Grey and stern as they are at the summit, near the base these rocks are clad in the loveliest foliage, and wherever a fissure in their sides gives room for a root to penetrate, there is a curtain of emerald leaves. For a long way the beauty of the scene is unmarred by the so-called improvements, and we feel we are really travelling under the shadow of the forest primeval. But on a corner being turned, the usual hideous array of trunk-covered ground and bare sticks, which look what they really are, the naked skeletons of burnt trees tortured in the fire, spring up around us. On reaching the burnt ground, we come to a creek that has had its rocky bed torn into strange shapes by a great slip from the top of the overlooking spurs. Mr. Worsley was camped near when the slip came down, and woke and listened to the terrible thunder of the descending rocks. But they spared him, stopping their mad course, however, only a few yards from his tent. It must be remembered that the writer fully recognises the absolute necessity of clearing the bush away, but he cannot help regretting it. The reason that the upper part of the Peraki Valley is certainly more beautiful than any other place on the peninsula is that it is so completely in a state of nature. One great mass of varied foliage, musical with birds. It will go soon, and with it will vanish the wild pigeons and the majority of the other birds. Mrs. Snow and Anson did their very best to save some of the handsomer trees in the valley. A few groves left here and there will, at any rate, remind one in a year or two of a beauty that will then have passed away forever. But to resume. On and on we go down the long valley, the beautiful harbour being full in sight, its sheltered waters smooth as a mill pond, while white crests ornament the waves outside. There is a calm beauty in this scene, too, different, of course, from the mighty grandeur of the peaks and the wondrous variety of the forest tints, but yet of exceeding merit. The centre of the valley is still here and there dotted with scrub, and wherever water has seamed the side of the spurs, a line of green bushes marks its course. Here and there the picturesque tents and huts of the bush and grass-seed cutters relieve the eye, and beyond all, the two long low spurs clasp in a loving shelter that historical sheet of water on whose beach landed the first white settlers of this island. Crossing numerous small creeks, we at last reached the station, which is sheltered from the northwest by a row of great gum trees. The house is surrounded by a pleasant orchard, which was planted and tended with great care by one of those Karus who were its former proprietors. It is said that when he left, he cut down 2 pear trees, saying that the fruit was so delicious he could not bear to think of strangers eating it. There are convenient buildings all round, and good paddocks for the cattle. The yards and woolshed are some little distance down the flat towards the sea. There are some 5,000 acres on the Peraki run, which is now the property of Mr. F.A. Anson, Mr. Snow, who was formerly in partnership, having gone to the north. The great historical interest in Peraki centres in the old whaling settlement that once existed on the beach. From Mr. Anson's house to the sea, one cannot take a step without being reminded of the incidents recorded in Hempelmann's famous diary. It will be remembered that it was at that place the brig B landed Hempelmann and his men to prosecute the whale fishery in the year 1835. There are still thousands of the bones of whales to testify to the success of the party. Great heaps of them are all around one, standing at high water mark. And there are more sad memorials also in the mounds that mark the spot where some of these adventurous men, who met their death by drowning, lie buried. On the left-hand side, looking seaward, is a rock called Simpson's Rock, where that veteran whaler used to look out for whales, and nearly underneath it is the point where the unfortunate steamer Westport received the injuries that eventually caused her total loss. The site of the Long House, the principal building in the old whaling times, is still visible, and so are the places where the cauldrons were fixed, in which the oil was tried out. It was here that Bloody Jack came with his followers to demand the lives of those North Island Maori boys that were working there, the safety of one of whom was purchased by Hempelmann and his men by the present of a boat. By the by, we have all heard that Hempelmann saved the life of one of these boys by heading him up in a cask and so hiding him from his enemies, but an altogether new version of this story is now current. It appears it was not one of the boys at all who was headed up in the cask, but a young fellow who came from Wairira to Peraki, and who, knowing that Bloody Jack and his party were coming to Peraki, kept it a secret from Hempelmann. When the party did come, and the boy Jackie was killed, and the other boy ransomed for the boat, Hempelmann was so angry at not having received warning from this man of their danger that he headed him up in a cask as a punishment, and kept him there for weeks, feeding him through the bunghole. It was only at the intercession of some other Maoris he at last consented to his release, and when the cask was broken open and he was liberated, he was nearly dead with a frightful stench and the cramped position in which he had been kept so long. Mr. Simpson told me that a Maori girl was also killed there, and that the flesh was distributed, so that it has been the scene of more than one dark tragedy. It must indeed have been a lonely place in those days, and the brave fellows who lived there showed great courage. The bush then came down to the water's edge, and rude and toilsome was the path leading to the harbour of Akaroa. Even when they got there, it was a great chance if they could have any aid, as for many months in the year there were no vessels there, so that it may be said they carried their lives in their hands. Hempelmann must not only have been a courageous but a very politic man to save his little settlement in safety when the fierce natives could have murdered them whenever it suited their will. Many a weary night he must have spent, fearing the worst, and he certainly had a just claim on the government for a good grant of land after surmounting so many perils. His first claim was, I believe, the whole of the Peraki Valley, bounded by the crest of the 2 spurs and the summit of the main range. But, as we know, he afterwards grew more ambitious and claimed a huge slice of the peninsula. Simpson tells me that the men had very hard times when they first landed at Peraki. Hempelmann brought some boards for his house, but the others had to sleep in casks for some time, and afterwards they put up such very temporary erections, being entirely unused to whare building, that they had to be stayed by lines, which had to be shifted when the wind changed, so that they should not be blown over. Hempelmann's first wife was buried there, but I do not know the exact spot. In fact, the sand has drifted in patches over what seems to have been the principal part of the settlement, which was not far above high water mark. One large mound is said to denote the grave of a Maori chief, but Peraki has never been a great Maori burying place. In the adjoining bay, on Mr. Buchanan's property, known as Tumbledown Bay, there are great numbers of human bones, which are sometimes laid bare by the action of the sea, and then again covered by the friendly sand. Peraki Beach is a beautiful smooth and sandy one, without rocks, and shelving so gradually that we had to walk out a very long distance at low water before we could get far enough to bathe. The bay abounds with fish, and Mr. Thomas Bruff and others used to go there to catch moki, kawhaia, and butter and crayfish, with which latter the rocky ledges absolutely swarm. End of section 37. Section 38 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Mr. Philip Ryan. In the long gully that runs up to the reserve for half-castes from the back of the former site of Joblin's Mill, now a part of Mr. Montgomery's estate in the Western Valley Little River, there is a comfortable whare of the old type in a very snug corner by the creek side, which the winds pass by and the morning sun shines on. Here with his son dwells Mr. Philip Ryan, one of those peninsular pioneers whose life has been one long struggle in the van of colonization. He is a man of fine presence, and must have possessed great strength in his time. Even now, after a long and toilsome life that has nearly reached 90 years, he is full of intelligence, and by no means wanting in bodily as well as mental vigour. He lives up here in the hills with his son, who is a half-caste, Mr. Ryan having married a Maori many years ago, who was his good and faithful wife till death came. He was born in Ireland in 1802, and his father was in the Commissariat Department of the British Army during the Peninsular War. To Lisbon he went with his mother very early in the 19th century, and his early years were passed in following the movements of the gallant men whom Wellesley eventually led to victory. It was only a month before Waterloo that he returned with his family to England. His early life had given him a taste for wandering and adventure, and when peace came he sought the sea, and made 5 voyages out of London. He was at the North Sea Fishery, and there served in a vessel of which our well-known Hempelmann was mate. He was for a time in the Navy, then turned his attention to the South Seas. Here he was cast away on his first voyage on one of the Society Islands. After this he made his way to Sydney, and from thence came to Otago in the schooner Return in 1838. Here he stopped for a time, but afterwards went in the same vessel to Timaru, where he was engaged during the whaling season of 1839. From thence he and 2 other men went to Ōnawe. They were fitted out with all requisites for whaling by Mr. Waller of Sydney, and got plenty of hands to help them from the runaway sailors who left ships in Otago and Akaroa, for at that time there were a great many ships coming in. Mr. Price was at Ikaraki at the time, and there were whaling stations at Peraki and Akaroa also. On August the 9th, 1840, which was a glorious day, Mr. Ryan saw a man-of-war's boat pulling into the bay at Ōnawe, and a lieutenant soon landed, and coming up to the house, asked him if he could give any information regarding the Comte de Paris. The lieutenant told him he belonged to a British vessel of war named the Britomart. Ryan told the lieutenant that a man named Holy Joe, the same mentioned by James Robinson Clough, had come over the hill that morning and could give all the news. Holy Joe told the lieutenant that the Comte de Paris had been in Pigeon Bay, that some of her people had landed, and had cut their names in the trees in that locality, now known as Holmes Bay, but that no French flag had been hoisted, and there seemed to be no intention to land anything from the ship. This was all the news Joe could give, and as it was late, the lieutenant and his crew stopped at Ryan's house that night, and left at 4 a.m. so as to be back in Akaroa at the ship by 8 a.m. There were boats ready to intercept the Comte de Paris if she had attempted to enter Akaroa harbour, and a party went over the hills to Pigeon Bay, led by some Maori guides, to see no landing was effected there and no French flag hoisted. At noon on the 10th, the flag was formally hoisted by Captain Stanley, who was in command of the Britomart, and a formal proclamation made by Mr. Robinson, the government agent on board, taking possession of the South Island in the name of Her Majesty the Queen. It was Mr. Robinson who conducted all the subsequent transactions with the French, and Mr. Ryan speaks of him as a most able and kindly man. The guns fired to salute the newly hoisted standard were distinctly heard at Peraki, Ōawe and Ioraki, the wind being light and the day exceedingly fine. After that season, Ryan went to Port Levy, Mr. Waller having failed. Thence he started a fishery at Motenau on his own account, but that was a failure, and so he came back to Port Levy, where he lived many years, being soaring most of the time with Tom White, who was still alive and hearty. He went 2 trips to America during this period, and one to Napier as mate of a brig, and in this latter excursion had the misfortune to break his leg. He used to carry the mail to Akaroa through the bush, and said he thought the trees on the way would not be cleared for 100 years, but they are all gone now. The mail then used to go once every 2 or 3 months when a ship came in. The steamers then began coming about, and the whalers deserted the coast. Besides, whale oil fell in price, and so from all these causes the whale fishery was, in a great measure, discontinued. Ryan remembers Mr. Fleming's first arrival in Port Levy. He came out in the Sir George Seymour, one of the first 4 ships, and he and Mr. Arthur Waghorn, now of Little Akaroa, walked over the hills. Ryan says they had had good clothes on when they started, but in their passage through the bush these had been torn all to pieces, and they were in tatters on arrival. Tom White came to Ryan and asked him to entertain them, as his whare was so very untidy, because he had so many youngsters about, and so Ryan did. Ryan was the first man who sawed timber in Little River. He worked with an Australian native named Green. Ryan was a cooper by trade, and it was that which made him so important at the whale fisheries. Mr. Ryan is very anxious to correct an error in the first edition of the Banks Peninsula stories, which states that James Robinson Clough was an American. He says he knew him well, and all about his family, and he was a native of Lincoln, England. Mr. Ryan declares that the Maoris of the peninsula were an amicable and honest lot of people who never harmed anyone materially. He declares that the greatest violence ever offered was to take the tobacco, and perhaps part of the clothing of a runaway sailor, but says that, even then, they never allowed their victim to go hungry. The old gentleman was cooking whilst the writer was there, and a very good cook he is, but he's exceedingly reticent, as most are who have lived much in the bush. His greatest trouble is the gradual failing of his sight, which prevents him from reading. His son is one of the finest men it has been the writer's lot to see, and would make a model for the Farnese Hercules. He and his father are much attached, and lead a very pleasant and homely life in this lonely whare, hidden in the spurs of the great ranges. End of section 38. Section 39 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Mr. Thomas White. Mr. Thomas White, though he must be over 80 years of age, is very hale and hearty, and lives with his son, Mr. George Wright, in their pleasant home at the head of Holmes Bay. Like many of our pioneers, he is an old sailor, and also a whaler, and in his long acquaintance with the peninsula has seen it advance from a Maori-populated resort of occasional whalers to the pleasant home of 5,000 Europeans. Mr. White is an American, having been born at Rhode Island. He became an orphan at a very early age, his father being killed in one of the Mexican wars, and his mother dying, and his youthful days were spent under the roof of a friend of his dead parents. Rhode Island, as many people know, is a great place for shipping, and at 14 Mr. White went to sea. He learnt the ropes in several uneventful voyages, the only part of which he seems to care to dwell upon being a quarrel with the mate of a whaler at Rio Janeiro, which ended in his being left at that port, whence he shipped to England, arriving on the Thames on that very day of King William IV's coronation. He shipped in a London whaler called the Timur, and in her he spent 3 years, one of his shipmates being our own Billy Simpson, formerly living in the Akaroa hospital. The first part of New Zealand he visited was the Bay of Islands, to which place he came from England in a whaler called the Achilles. He left her at this place and went to Sydney in the Sir William Wallace. In Sydney he joined another whaling brig called the Genii and spent 13 months in her on the New Zealand coast. His next vessel was the Caroline, belonging to Johnny Jones of Otago, and on her being sold in Sydney he came to Wakawaiti in a brig commanded by Captain James Bruce as a passenger. This vessel landed 23 horses, which were amongst the first brought to this colony. From Wakawaiti he went to Otago, and was there engaged by Paddy Wood to go fishing at Oashore, and lived at that place some years, working for Price some of part of his time. During this time, Bloody Jack's men killed a North Island boy, but otherwise all was quiet. The whaling being very profitable sometimes, and an exceedingly poor game at others. Went to Port Levy, and from there made a journey to Riccarton for food, getting 15 bushels of wheat from a store deposited by Gilbert and Harridge. At this time there were only 2 Maoris at Port Levy, and none in Pigeon Bay, but they kept coming in their sea-going canoes, many being from the North Island, and soon there were quite strong settlements at both places. An old man named Jack Duff sold some bone and had money in his possession about this time, and mysteriously disappeared. His wife last saw him in the company of a Spaniard, and a man known as Flash Harry. Provisions were very dear at times, $25 being sometimes given for a barrel of flour. The Maoris as a whole were very good to the whites, and Bloody Jack himself was a very good fellow indeed. Once he came to White's house and demanded food. It was given him, of course, and a short time after a hog was sent as a present in return. At Port Levy, Mr. White married, and soon began to have a family around him. A tragedy took place when his son Harry was a baby. A Dutch whaling ship put into Port Levy, and the carpenter and several others deserted. The third mate made himself very active in arresting the men, and caught 2 and got them back to the ship. The carpenter came to White's house, and the mate after him. White was on the veranda with Harry the baby in his arms, and the carpenter and 2 runaways were sitting at a table inside the house. The mate ordered the carpenter aboard, but instead of obeying, he shot him through the heart with the pistol that was in his possession. Word was sent to Wellington, but the ship was away before any steps were taken, and so nothing was done. Had the doctor of the ship remained behind, no doubt the man would have been hung. The natives used to travel over the hills easily in those days of no roads. White has known a party to take 2 tons of dogfish to Little River, the Maoris there bringing in exchange 2 tons of eels. An old Maori, bearing the pleasant name of Rakika Kanoki, was especially celebrated for the way in which he travelled the hills. White was at Port Levy when the Flemings came out in 1855, but a few years later went to Pigeon Bay. The bay was full of sawyers at that time, and a man named Billy Webb, who kept a shanty at a place called the Pillar, on the road between Pigeon Bay and Holmes Bay, has sometimes as many as 40 boarders. One of these boarders fell over on the rocks and smashed his head, and the question of foul play was raised, but it is probable it was a pure accident. Several vessels were built at Port Levy and Pigeon Bay. White himself assisted in building one 18-ton craft, and Damon built several. A vessel was built for the natives at Nelson, and on her arrival, Damon offered them 12 cows for her, and cows were cows in those days, but they would not sell. The Maoris grew many vegetables and kept many pigs at that time, and as a whole dealt fairly with the whites. There was a big plantation of kumaras near where Mr. Menzies' house now stands, and it appears to be the only place where these roots have ever been successfully grown on the peninsula. Mr. White's life has been uneventful in Pigeon Bay. He has reared a large family who have lived happily together till, in the ordinary course of things, they married and went to houses of their own. After the whaling, White took to soaring and other work like the rest, and eventually settled on a small farm. A hardy and enterprising pioneer, he has done his share in reclaiming the wilderness and peopling it, and, in spite of his advanced age, is still hearty. Let us hope that he has still many years of quiet happiness before him amongst his children and grandchildren. End of section 39. Section 40 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Mr. William Isaac Haberfield. This old identity has a most interesting history, for particulars of which we are indebted to the Dunedin Evening Star. His narrative is as follows. I was born in Bristol on the 3rd of June 1815, about a fortnight before Waterloo was fought. There is the entry, in the Bible, in my father's handwriting. He was a captain in the Navy. This is his portrait in his uniform, and owing to his position, I was placed as a youngster in the upper school at Greenwich, a school for the sons of naval officers. As soon as I was old enough, I went to sea, joining a brigantine that was trading to the Mediterranean for fruit, and the first work I ever did was to handle a ballast shovel. In this ship we made trips not only to the Mediterranean, but also to Portugal and Spain, and we were for some time running to Newfoundland. I next joined His Majesty's brig, the Snake, as a middy, and went away in her to the Brazilian coast, where she was employed by Admiral Seymour in chasing pirates and slavers. The Admiral was there in the Spartiate, his headquarters being Rio. My next experience was a voyage to the colonies. I joined a ship that was bringing out a batch of male convicts, shipped at Sheerness and bound for Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land, as it was then called. Since then, I have never left the colonies. I got clear of the vessel in Sydney and came from that port to New Zealand. This is as much as you need to know of my early life, which was a lively one, as you may guess. But of course, what you want to know is what took place after I came to New Zealand. Well, I'll tell you. I came to Otago in a brig named the Micmac and landed at Otago on the 17th of March 1836, St. Patrick's Day. The very day after we landed, we killed a couple of fair-sized whales right up in the harbour. They were the first whales I ever saw killed. The boats were not away more than 20 minutes before they had them both, and they were killed in a twinkling. And I want to say here that we had 2 white women on board. Make mention of that, please. I'll tell you why. I had a regular laugh to myself when I read in one of the papers a little while ago that Mrs. Tom Jones was the first white woman to come to Otago. It shows what a precious lot they knew about it. Why, there was Mrs. Bryn. She came down from Sydney with her husband and the Bee brig long before Mrs. Jones, and was here in Otago for some 3 years, eventually going back to Sydney with her husband, who was whaling at Wakawaiti in Otago. Bryn Point was named after her, from the circumstance that she frequented the spot to look out for the boats when they were after whales. And the women we brought in the Micmac were here before Mrs. Bryn was. One of them was Mrs. Flood, and the other was Mrs. Garrett. They came with their husbands. Garrett was a sawyer to trade, and went away in the brig the same trip, taking his wife with him. Flood was the storekeeper of the vessel, and left New Zealand again in the October or the November following our arrival. He had been a sergeant in the army, and a nice fellow he was. Neither the Garretts nor the Floods had any children. The owners wouldn't bring anyone that had children, or encumbrances, as they were called. But I'm getting off my course. I was going to tell you how I came here. This brig that I came in, her captain was a Welshman. I forget his name. I think he owned the vessel. He did so far as we knew. A whaler? No, she wasn't a whaler. She was a merchant vessel, loaded up with a general cargo for the Wellers place.
No, I don't suppose you do know much about the Wellers, but they were big people in those days, as you may believe when I tell you that they then had 12 vessels whaling for them. There were two brothers. One was George, and the other was named Edward, or it may have been Edwin. Well, I'm not sure which. They had the only store in the place anywhere about these parts, and was a pretty big store it was. It was in the harbour. Otago Harbour it was called. What you call the lower harbour now. No, the store was not exactly on the heads. It was on the point next to what is now known as Arrington Point, close to what you know as the Kike. Edward, or Edwin, Weller was there himself. He and his brother were among the oldest colonists in New South Wales. The Mr. Weller I'm speaking of had been a prisoner among the Maoris at Hokianga in his younger days, and while there he got to understand the Maoris and speak their language. He never owned any land, either in the North Island or the South, though he might have had as much as he could see almost for the asking. He was just a trader, and he stuck to his business. He is, I believe, alive now in New South Wales. Very old man he must be. The store that he had was always well stocked with all kinds of slops and other things, and they used to sell as cheap or cheaper than you can get things now. You could buy a splendid blanket for 10 shillings, and I don't suppose you'd get it for much less now. No, that was not the only whaling station on this part of the coast. Afterwards there were whaling stations at Wakawahiti and at the mouth of the Tairi, and to the north there were stations at Timaru and Banks Peninsula, which used to be a famous place for whales in those days. But those stations were all planted after my time. If you want to know which was the first whaling station in this part of the country, I should say it was the one at Preservation Inlet. I have heard so. That was a very old one. The next was the one at Otago, where I came to. Then came our place at Peraki, and the season after we started they set up a station at Wakawahiti. Johnny Jones? No one had even heard of Johnny Jones then. The people that started whaling at Wakawahiti were Long, Wright and Richards. They were Sydney merchants. They whaled one season and they pitched it up. Failed, I believe. It was then that Johnny Jones came on the scene. He bought them out in Sydney, taking their boats, huts, slops, other stores, gear, tripods and everything they had. Jones sent down the barque Magnet under Captain James Bruce to take possession. Bruce dropped his anchor in Wakawahiti Bay in the middle of the night. Before daylight had padlocked the storehouse and had taken charge of everything movable. The men, who at this time had not been paid, were inclined to rebel, and John Miller, who was away in charge of a boat at the time of the seizure, refused on his return to give up the boat. Eventually, I believe, the men got a passage to Sydney and obtained the money due to them from Messrs. Long, Wright and Richards. But we must hold on. I'm going on a bit too fast. I came down, as I was going to say, under engagement to the Wellers. I and the others were under agreement to the firm for the whaling season, which, for bay whaling, reckoned from the middle of March to the middle of October. They kept me for shore work mostly, giving us all sorts of jobs in summertime, when, as I have said, there was no whaling. One of the things we did was to go to Purakanui to blast stones and put up a fishing station there. One of our headmen was a Sydney native named Hughes, a real smart fellow either at shore work or in the boats, especially about whales. He had a fancy to leave the Wellers, and did so in the June or July after we arrived. 2 American vessels called in, and he went with them. One of these was called the Merrimac, the other was the Martha. Captain Potter was master of the Martha. They were bound for Banks Peninsula after fish, and a rare good time of it they had. As I was told afterwards, they filled up in Peraki Bay just about as fast as the men could work. Well, when they were full, they came our way again, bringing Hughes with them. He was all agog to have a try in his own hook. He had brought 2 boats with him and a complete outfit for starting a station. These things had been got from the Yankee ships, and he at once set about getting together a party from those of us who were willing to join. Our time with Mr. Weller was up in October, as I've told you, and 6 of us agreed to go in with Hughes. We went round in boats to have a look at the place which he had selected, Peraki Point as the site for the station, and everyone could see at once that a better spot could not be wished for. There was good shelter, sound anchorage, a knobby landing, and plenty of wood, besides which Peraki was a very pretty place, and above all there were plenty of fish about. So we thought it a good spec to join Hughes. There were 3 partners in the affair, Hughes and a man named Thompson, and Sivert, a cooper. The cooper was a very important man in all whaling parties, for you see, we always get the staves down in shooks. You know what shooks are? Yes, bundles of staves, and he had to rattle them together, and this took him all his time. I've seen any amount of those chaps that will put together their 20 tons a day single-handed. Well, as I was going to say, we were all on a lay. You know what a lay is, I suppose. If you're on 100th, when 100 tons are got, you get 1. And when you're on a lay, they find you. That's the difference between a lay and going shares. If you're on shares, you find yourself. But of course you get a better chance than in a lay. The men get different interests according to agreement. A pulling hand will get, say, 1 share, a steerer 1.5, and a headsman 2 shares, just as is agreed on. As I said, there were 3 partners in the spec, and the rest of us were on a lay. 6 of us white men, and 6 Maoris we brought with us from Otago. They were fine strapping fellows. We had our eyes open in getting them to join the party. You see, we got on very well with the Maoris, but there was just a chance that that state of things wouldn't last forever, and it seemed to us that we had a double chance of securing a peaceful and quiet time by having these chaps with us. They were sons of chiefs. If the worst did come to the worst, we had them with us, don't you see? Hughes was the head man of our party. We sailed from Otago in the Magnet brig, Captain Bruce, the man I referred to a while ago. You must have heard of him. He died at Akaroa some time ago. And we cast anchor just inside the point where the lighthouse now is on the day after Christmas 1836. And a beautiful place it was. The bush was growing right down to the edge of the water. Everything was quiet and untouched by anyone, and I doubt whether men had ever landed, for the pigeons would come and light on your heads, and the carkers weren't frightened when they saw us. The only thing that was short was water. There was but 1 pool on the peninsula, and there is only one now, strange to say. You can't get water anywhere else, and all we get now is from the roofs of the houses. The water in the pool isn't fit to use, excepting for cattle. It took us 2 days to land our things from the brig. There were a great many things to get ashore, and the try-pots were heavy. At last we got everything out of the Magnet, and she went away. There were very few Maoris here in Peraki. The small party, some 9 all told, under Tongatahara, lived at the point, but none of the present tribe were here. Tongatahara's people went to Akaroa soon after we came, and during our 2nd season, the tribe now living at Peraki came from Kaiapoi. I mean, of course, the fathers and grandfathers of these natives. Only 2 or 3 of the old ones are left. Raupraha had driven them from their original holdings. It is scarcely correct to call them a tribe either. They were the remnants of 5 tribes or hapus, all that were left after Raupraha's repeated massacres, and came down here to keep out of his road, since, although he had been badly beaten in Cloudy Bay, they lived in constant dread of his reappearance. It was about 1838 that the Maoris first came to Peraki. They made the trip in canoes and 1 whaleboat which they had picked up somewhere, a worn-out old thing that some of the whalers had very likely cast off or given to them. When we saw the fleet coming, we hadn't the least idea what the purpose of the expedition was, and you may guess that we were pleased to find out later on that the uninvited settlers were peaceably inclined. Of course, we soon got to see a good deal of the Maoris, and we always got on very well with them. We started the first season with 2 boats, 6 oars in each, and our venture turned out very well. Whales were plentiful and not hard to take. They used to come right into the bay. There were so many of them we could almost always pick the ones we wanted. As I said, we landed at Peraki the day after Christmas and commenced in March, And by the end of the season for bay whaling, middle of August, we had taken 23 whales. That was not at all bad. They came to somewhere about 80 to 90 tons of oil. We had no difficulty in getting rid of it. There were any number of traders ready to make a deal and go anywhere for it. The first vessel that came to our station was a brigantine, about 90 tons, called the Sydney Packet. She came in July, bringing us provisions and shooks to carry on with, and prepared to trade for our oil and bone. While she was laying to in anchor in the bay, there a gale got up and she came ashore. There was no life lost. Indeed, there was no one hurt. First the stock of her anchor gave way, then she got another one down, and the chain parted, and away she came, quiet and comfortable like, onto the beach. They took care to put her on a soft place, and all hands got ashore without any flurry. We tried to get her off, but could not do so. We gradually broke her up. We got our oil out of her. She had 6 or 7 tons in her hold at the time. We also got her boats and cut away the rigging. In fact, all the movable things about her. The beach was a steep one then. She lay pretty close in. All the things that we saved were taken away by the magnet when she next called. The life we led there was a jolly one. There was plenty of work and fair pay for it, though we thought it rather odd that the vessels would give us no more than £14 a ton for the oil and 1 shilling a pound for the whalebone. These were carefully measured and weighed out on the beach before any of the stuff left us, and I can tell you we looked sharply after our own interests. The only thing that bothered us was that you hadn't got too much of a change in tucker. We had a bit of beef at first, all salt, mind you, but that soon ran out, and then we lived on fish and carcass and pigeons, and for vegetables we had to fall back on fern root, with a few potatoes now and then, which we had to go down to Otago for. We also brought some pigs up, and they were the first ever seen in Mulraki. We built sties for them and kept them as long as we could, but we couldn't go on finding food for them, as we wanted all our tucker for ourselves, so we had to let them go. They were the first of the pigs that afterwards spread all over this part of the country. As soon as we could spare time, we made gardens, and then we were all right. We had heaps of fish and spuds, and if that kind of food will make a man a Maori, I must be as much a Maori as anyone in the country. After the first season, Hughes went over to Sydney for a trip. If I haven't told you before, you may as well write down here that Hughes died in Hampton, somewhere about 7 years ago, upwards of 80 years of age, and he was buried there. He was just the sort of man for early colonial life. He could do anything, and had seen everything there was to see this side of the world. His father had been a soldier, and came out as one of the guard over a batch of prisoners in one of the first convict ships that sailed for Sydney. Well, as I was saying, Hughes went for a trip to Sydney, and he brought back a couple of new boats with him, so we had 4 to commence our second season with. That was a lively season. Whales were numerous again. We got on very well. In the middle of our busiest time, we had the bad luck to have one of our new boats smashed, knocked to pieces without ever being fast to a whale. We were out one day and hard at it, the boat in which I was being fast to a big fellow. He was properly handled and was nigh about done, when another boat came up to put an iron into him. We could see that the whale was just dying. He was all of a tremble and shooting about here and there. We sang out to the other fellows to stand off, but I suppose they didn't hear us. At any rate, they came up in a roundabout way and were pretty close, when he suddenly made a rush right in their direction and went clean over her, turning her over by sheer weight, and in a minute or two our brand new boat was floating about this bay in shingles. We cut our line sharp, and the whale sank dead after his last effort. But we picked him up 2 days afterwards and got him in all right. It was a good one too. They're not the largest I have seen. The best one for oil I ever helped to try out was a cow and calf that yielded about 11 tons. There was nobody hurt. We picked up the men in the water, and they didn't think anything of the affair. We didn't make such a precious fuss about a thing of that sort as people would nowadays. They get a wet shirt now they must see the doctor, or else they die of a fright. We had no doctors, and if we had, we shouldn't have bothered them. I suppose you won't believe, but I give you my word that I have never tasted physic all my life and never wanted it. But I must say we were pretty lucky. We didn't have any serious accidents. Losing our boat was the worst one, and none of our party were ever hurt. No, sir, we did not fall out and knock each other about. We had no rows at all. Do you know what kept things so quiet with us? We had no drink. It was an agreement with us that there should be none. Vessels that came here for oil had it with them, but we never allowed a drop to be put ashore. Now and again some of the boys had a nip when they went down to Weller's place at Otago, but that was a long way to go for a drink. And besides, the men were a steady lot and didn't much care about grog. The third season we increased our party and worked 5 boats. One was a 7-oared boat, but she was no use. She was too long. That was a good season too, but whales were getting to not be quite so plentiful. And to cut the yarn short, they got scarcer and scarcer, till after we had stuck together for 5 seasons, the game was hardly paying us. It was not enough to buy a suit of slops after a season's work, so I went out. The others kept on for some time, but I'd had enough of it. Another man and me then started to run a whaleboat to Wakaiti and Peraki, bringing pigs, potatoes and other things from Otago. Weller's was still the only settlement there. There was no such place as Dunedin. The name even was unknown. All round where Dunedin was afterwards built, it was nothing but scrub, and it was a great place for pigs. Port Chalmers was then called Kopute. You were asking just now about the Maoris, and I may as well at this stage tell you something about them. In those early days there were, as I have said, none about the hills where Dunedin now stands, and not very many at Weller's place. But there was an important settlement at the heads, where the natives had a fortified pa, and another at Purakanui. Did I know Taiaroa? Yes, sir, I did. Very well. Not the present Taiaroa, but his father, a regular thoroughgoing Maori, who couldn't speak a word of English. He was much shorter than this Taiaroa, but a man of enormous strength. But he wasn't the head man among the heads Maoris then, not by a long chalk. The principal man among them died soon after I got to Otago. Must have been the first season I was there. They called him Tattoo. That wouldn't be his proper name, but is what we all called him. He was a man whose history ought to be written by someone. He was a noble fellow, a real natural chief. Though he had been to Sydney several times, he was in all respects a pure Maori in his ways, as well as in his appearance. But he was a superior stamp of a man, liked by everyone, and respected by all. He was always strangely quiet and dignified, and he had the manners of a gentleman. One could see that as he went about, he was always eager to understand everything he saw among the white men, but he would seldom ask. He seemed to be anxious to avoid bothering anyone with his questions, and he was never known to ask for anything. Besides, he never touched spirits, and he had a way of his own of enforcing obedience without arguing the point, and without using bad language. Poor fellow! He did not live to see an old age. He was still almost a young man when he sickened and died of consumption. I went to see him when he was sick, and just as I would have done for any decent man, I tried to find out what he wanted, and it struck me that a comfortable pillow would help him to lie a bit easier. So I fetched him a feather pillow that I brought with me from England. My mother gave it me when I was coming away. The Maoris looked on this act as one of extraordinary kindness on my part, and they never forgot it. They would do anything for me. I must say that I've always found them mindful of any good turn, and anxious to show their gratitude. But their kindness to me for lending that pillow was far beyond what might have been expected. When Tattoo died, the next best man was Jackie White. Karatai was his proper name. He was a more important man than old Taiaroa, who, as I have said, or intended to say, was only of third-rate importance then. What sort of people the Maoris were? Well, you may safely say that they were an industrious, decent living lot. They used to be great hands at fishing. I've seen a dozen, and sometimes as many as 20 canoes go out of a morning fishing for barracuda, and they would take their double canoes outside the heads without fear of being blown off. Sometimes, too, they used to go in boats where they could get them. As to drink, they did not often take it. It is a lie to say that they were a drinking crowd. Those engaged at Wellers were entitled, as well as the whites, to a gill of rum in the morning before going out. Do you know what the Maoris did? They carefully bottled it off as they got it, and afterwards sold it to the white people a little less than the price at the store. That's a fact, and I should like you to print it. They never drank the rum themselves, but they was always ready to make a bargain with the white men for it. Yes, they were naturally businessmen rather than drinkers. You folk who get your ideas of what the Maoris are like from the poor specimens you see about towns have a wrong notion altogether of what they are like when left to themselves without contact with the white man. Another good thing about the Maoris, as I knew them, was that they are very particular about their women. Infidelity on the part of either husband or wife was punishable with death, and among unmarried people the relationships were as decent, to say the least of it, as you would find in communities of Europeans. The women had to work, but only at what were looked on as their proper tasks. But it was considered the right thing for a chief to have several wives. I'm bound to admit that, because it's a fact. Jackie White had 4 or 5, and most of them had 2 or 3. They were supposed to have as many as they could keep, or they were allowed to, which comes to about the same thing. These wives, however, no matter how many there were always properly treated and not regarded as concubines, nor could they be put away at the will of their chief. Perhaps you don't know it, but it's quite true that the Maoris in those days had slaves. Each chief had some. I could never quite make out how they got these slaves, nor what their position was, but we always concluded that they had been prisoners taken in war. They did all the dirty work. It might be bought or sold, and it was no offence if a master killed one of them. I don't know anything about cannibalism among them. I never saw any, and they would never confess to having been given to that ungodly practice. Still, I know that a slave's life was at his master's mercy, and goodness knows whether in the olden days they always buried one that they knocked on the head. I once knew one of those slaves very well. Hughes, who was here before me, owned one. He was a big fella that we used to call Rogers. The Maoris were going to kill him, so the yarn went, and Hughes took pity on him and tried to save his life. The Maoris wouldn't listen to what he had to say, so Hughes thought he would buy the man, and he went to the store, drew a lot of slops against his credit, and gave them to the Maoris for Rogers. The natives did not touch Rogers after that, but looked on him as Hughes' property. The poor fellow came with us afterwards, and died while in our service. While I was going in and out among the Maoris, an incident occurred which will give you an idea of life among these people. 3 American whalers were lying off Weller's Place, having put in to refresh with wood and water before going further with their crews. The carpenter belonging to one of these ships was on shore, staying at the house of a man named James Brown. There were a good many fellows about, and they had been making too free with the grog. One of the chaps there was a Maori, son of one of the petty chiefs, and he too had been drinking, just for once in a way. At any rate, what he had taken had got into his head. Well, this chief's son, he fell out with Brown, the master of the house, because Brown would not give him any more grog, upon which the Maori went away, loaded his gun, and came and stood outside Brown's window, waiting for a chance to shoot Brown. While he was waiting there, the carpenter happened to go to the door, and the Maori seized the chance to fire. I don't know whether he knew who it was at the door, but anyway, it was the carpenter who got the benefit of it, and he fell dead on the spot. The Maori at once made a bolt of it, and could not be found for 2 or 3 days. he was stowed away in the bush. At last, old Akaroa went and hunted him out and brought him to the store. "Here," he said, "is the man who shot the white man. Do as you like to him." The Maoris seemed to look on it as a matter of honour to find him. Mr. Weller put the man in irons and sent word all round to muster as many whites as possible. He thought that this outrage would start the Maoris into a general rising, that it would have been a serious matter, as they were pretty well armed. I went up among the others, and I can tell you there was a regular to-do. They clapped the murderer into a little room, and planted men to go sentry, go watch and watch, until we came to a decision as to what to do with him. Mr. Weller's idea was to send him to Sydney to be tried. The Yankees wanted us to let them take him off to one of their ships and hang him at the yardarm. We would not agree to that. It wouldn't be regular. And there we were. Didn't know how to get out of the fix. The situation was a pretty serious one, or would have been if the Maoris had been nasty, for there were a couple of thousand of them about the Kaik at that time, and about 400 or 500 more at Peraki, who could have come across pretty quick, but they did not seem dangerous. They said they would not trouble what we did with the man. Their idea was that as he had tried to kill Brown, Brown should be allowed to shoot him, and they would have been satisfied if the matter had ended that way. But we wouldn't have that. Well, I was standing outside the house where the Maori was locked up, and while talking with the others who were there, we saw Tom Brown come out. This Tom Brown was one of our men, the one whose turn it was to watch inside. He had just come out for a necessary purpose, leaving his gun behind. Before he could get back, we heard a report, and then I knew what had happened. I knew the Maori was cooked. We rushed in, and there was the Maori and his woman, both shot. We could see how it was done. She had raised him up to a sitting position, and then hugging him from behind, while he'd got the gun and pointed it towards his chest. The ball went right through him and lodged in the woman, and they were both dead. Then we saw how foolish we had been to let the woman be in the room with him. And of course everybody blamed Tom Brown for going out without taking his gun with him. But perhaps it all ended in the best way. The Maoris made no fuss. They said they were glad he had made away with himself. The last act in the tragedy was played by old Akaroa, who rolled up the man's body in a bundle and humped it away by himself, saying he was going to bury it. What he did with it, I can't tell you. No one ever saw the grave. Pitched the body overboard, perhaps. The woman was buried by her own people, and that was the finish of a very anxious time for all of us. As I've said, all the settlers that I know of who were in Otago before me are either away or dead. The two eldest I know of are Dick Driver, who was the first pilot in Otago and now lives in Peraki, and Mr. Apes of Wakawiti. The latter is coming down to see me and have a chat about old times. I had a visit from Captain Jackson Barry some time ago, and he wanted to make out that he knew all about these parts in the earliest days, but I soon settled him. He began by asking me if I remembered the first whaling man here, Johnny Jones. I replied that I knew the first whaler here and that it wasn't Johnny Jones, that I was here myself long before Johnny Jones saw a flax bush. And that was enough for Mr. Barry, or whatever you call him. I can't abide these men who let on to know what they don't know anything about. Mr. Haberfield's subsequent history has been full of adventures. As modestly told by himself, he altogether settled at Peraki after he had been running a whaleboat for some time, and then, feeling rather restless, he shipped with Captain Cole on the schooner Rory O'More, which called at Peraki on her way to Akaroa for a stock of pigs, to take up with some other provisions to some American whalers that were lying there. This was a somewhat eventful trip. On arrival at Akaroa, she was engaged to convey to Wellington a prisoner who had been arrested for breaking into a store. The prisoner and the policeman, named Barry, and the witnesses were all to be taken up together. The schooner was owned by the well-known Paddy Hood, and she had first to make a trip to his settlement at the north end of 90 Mile Beach, where the little river empties itself, so as to get some provisions. On getting these aboard, she returned to Akaroa and picked up her party, which included an officer from a French man-of-war who wanted to go to Wellington to make arrangements for victualling the vessel. There were altogether 23 souls on board when the Rory O'More sailed for Wellington, a port she was not destined to reach, as she overran her reckoning in a fog and got jammed in Palliser Bay, where she was beached to save life, it being found that she could not help going ashore. The men stopped behind long enough to save the cargo, and then set out to walk to Wellington, which they reached in 3 days. Captain Cole was not in charge of the schooner when she was wrecked, another master having been shipped in his place. Mr. Haberfield was 3 months in Wellington, unable to get work, and scarcely able to obtain sufficient food, from which difficulty he was released by the opportune arrival of one of Johnny Jones's vessels, the Magnet, then under the charge of Captain Macfarlane, the mate of which, Mr. Lewis, took him on board and provided for him until he got a passage by her to Akaroa, from which place he was taken home by the schooner Mana, Captain Sweeney, a vessel that was to take a shipment of pigs from Peraki to Mr. Fraser's station on Mana Island. He then stayed at home for some years, afterwards shipping in the cutter Levian, Captain Arnott, for Port Levy on the Banks Peninsula, where lived a wealthy old bachelor named Greenwood, who gave him a freight of wool, cheese, and butter, with 32 sheep on deck for Wellington. This vessel, much overloaded, left Port Levy on Saturday afternoon, and the next, Sunday afternoon, dropped anchor in Wellington, opposite the Custom House, a feat that was, in those days, considered wonderful. A week later they left Wellington for Pigeon Bay, having on board a complete fit-out for a schooner then building there. Thence to Akaroa, where they took on board Mr. Watson, the magistrate there, and brought him to Otago. Thence she went to Ruapulke and on to Stewart Island, where Mr. Haberfield left her, coming back to Otago in a schooner called the Sisters, belonging to the Akaroa Maoris. About this time the survey of the Otago block was going on, and some 6 months afterwards, the survey being then finished, Captain Arnott brought the Levian into Otago harbour under contract to take the men, chainmen, bushmen, etc., engaged on the survey party to Wellington. Captain Arnott, who was no scholar, was very anxious to get Mr. Haberfield to ship with him this trip, as the latter on previous occasions had done all the ship's business for him. Haberfield, however, obstinately refused to go, not being pleased either with the vessel, which was crank, or the captain, who was reckless, besides a bad paymaster. Haberfield then went to Peraki in his boat, and Arnott, who left soon after him, dropped anchor in Peraki Bay, and made another attempt to get Haberfield on board. The latter was not to be persuaded, and the cutter had to leave without him. She was never heard of again, but a vessel which came into Akaroa reported having seen a cutter answering to her description found her in a squall off the Kaikoura's. She had 11 men on board, amongst them the Brown mentioned previously as being concerned in the shooting affair at Wellers. The Levian, it may be noted, was bought by Bloody Jack, Tuawak, and Toby of Ruapulke from an Auckland man. Bloody Jack was drowned at Timaru, while in charge of an expedition got up amongst the southern Maoris to go north and fight Raupraha, which expedition got no further than Banks Peninsula, and was then abandoned. The Levian then became the property of Toby and Kehu, a son of Bloody Jack. This Kehu, who was remarkable for having 6 toes on each foot, sailed with Haberfield and left the cutter with him, having no confidence in Arnott. Kehu was afterwards drowned in endeavouring to cross Fovo Strait in a whaleboat during a gale of wind. These are only some of the many adventures which Mr. Haberfield can relate. He was engaged in seafaring for several years, and at last settled down to enjoy a peaceful old age, which we trust will last for many years to come. Into section 40. Section 41 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Akaroa. Where do sunbeams brightest glisten, mid intricacies of shade? Where does lovelorn Tui listen to its mate and leafy glade? where, when earliest spring is waking from its sleep each leaflet's fold, to the zephyrs gently shaking, pave the coffee's roots with gold. Where, with melody surprising, does the bellbird welcome day, ere the golden sun arising makes the night mists pass away. Where do great corninis, laden with their million berries store, purple lips of many a maiden, 'tis in lovely Akaroa. Where do mighty tree-clad mountains solemnly guard the vales below, giving birth to many a fountain, where in winter lies the snow? Where do great totteras, flinging bronzed foliage to the sky, rest 1,000 songsters, singing hymns of rapture ere they fly? Where are great willows growing from Napoleon's distant grave? Where are creeks for ever flowing, giving verdure as they lave? Where do sun-clad wavelets wander to Zealandia's fairest shore, in embracing growing fonder? 'Tis in lovely Akaroa. Where do sunsets rays of glory, gold and purple raiment throw o'er the hills renowned and story in the Maori long ago? Where does wild clematis, flinging tendrils o'er the boughs below, cover sprays where birds are singing with a cloak of purest snow? Where in wild sequestered valley grows the wondrous Nico palm, forming ever verdant alley, where there is eternal calm? Where are silver fern trees spreading fairy fronds of beauty pure, aromatic fragrance shedding? 'Tis in lovely Akaroa. Where, when storms are raging madly, 'neath the bitter tempest's blast, does the sailor enter gladly, finding peaceful seas at last? Where does the Ditoki's glory blaze with scarlet many a glade, sheltered from nor'wester's fury by the pine tree's tasselled shade? Where are feet for ever pressing wondrous ferns of beauty rare, robed in nature's choicest dressing, ever fresh and passing fair? Where, when from the world we sever, seeking peace for evermore, should we choose to rest forever, 'tis in lovely Akaroa. Silas Wegg. End of section 41. Section 42 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Our Jubilee. The years roll on in this new land that gems the southern sea, as many an aged pioneer can prove right wearily. Men that shaped out the future for the thousands of their race, who needed sore in crowded homes a new abiding place. They taught this stubborn earth to smile with Europe's plants and flowers. They made the primal rocks reveal a Danae's golden showers. They bridged the flood, they drained the swamp, they tore the forest down, and made the golden corn to smile where waved the tussock brown. Nor they alone the victory won, for by their sides there stood full many an angel of the wild, a heroine of the wood, who urged them forth to high emprise, or where misfortune fell, would many a word of peace and hope and gentlest comfort tell. Who, like the rata when the pine is tottering to its fall, still held them in strong loving bands, and made them tower o'er all. And should not they who reaped the toil of all those early days give to the veterans their meed of due and hard-earned praise? Remember in luxurious days the trials of the past, and trumpet forth these heroes' deeds with no uncertain blast. 'Tis more than 50 years ago that Waitemata heard that this fair haven, Akaroa, had beautiful appeared to sons of the fair land of joy, of chivalry and song, who meant to seize its favoured shores and hold them firm and strong. Then all the Viking spirit rose in that small British band. What? Should they lose this favoured isle, this lovely southern land? Perish the thought! Should England's might like this be trampled down? A gem lost from her diadem, a jewel from her crown. So on her mission of emprise the Britomart was sent. True Argonauts were those brave hearts who in the vessel went. For sure they searched not vainly, and the fruit their wanderings bore was not a single golden fleece, but many a million more. We know the end. With high result the British dart was sped, and in the race for empire our doughty champions led. They gained our shores, and loud the cheers that rang across our seas, as old St. George's glorious cross flew bravely in the breeze. A greater or a happier day Zealandia never saw than this which bound to English rule her loveliest southern shore. But there has been one victory since, as great in thinkers' eyes. It brought no riches in its train, no vast material prize. Yet was a triumph for our laws, a glory to our land, that ne'er can fade while Britain's sons hold France's loving hand. The men who came to claim the soil, whom we had deemed our foes, settled our shores, and speedily fresh rivalry arose. The rivalry of industry, the striving each to prove supremacy in deeds of toil, in kindness, and of love. And after working side by side for many a weary day, at last the farther time came round when they were called to say, "Will ye be France or Britain's sons?" Ye know us now full well. Oh, noble was the answer that from their brave lips fell. We know you, and we love you, and this is our reply. Together we will fight or fall, together live or die. And now that 50 years are past since that old faithful band raised the proud standard of our Queen upon this fertile strand, we seek to brand it for all time, a landmark of our race, so that when, in the distant years, historians shall trace the records of the early days, when first this land of flowers was rendered by a daring deed for all the ages ours, they can point out the sacred spot where first our standard braved the winds that hover o'er the shores our peaceful waters laved. Still tell how France and Britain here forgot the feuds of old, and hand in hand and heart to heart did lovingly enfold. Silas Wegg. End of section 42. Section 43 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. The Legend of Ōnawe. Land of the forest and the hill, land of tall fern and tussock brown, where lake-like waters calm and still reflect the crags that o'er them frown, where mighty monsters of the deep, the tanifas of ancient story, watch their grim infants happy sleep, 'neath the southern planet's glory. Land of tall pine, of graceful vines, where tuis gurgle in the shade, where in white wreaths clematis twines, and carcass screams in ferny glade. How many a tale of passion past thy rocks could tell if speech were given, of heroes struggling to the last, of dire revenge, of races driven from this fair home, their last hopes riven. Where the proud waves come swelling high up Whangaroa's harbour fair, a peak mounts startling to the sky, with base like some gigantic pear. Sternly it meets the advancing tide, and bids the crested horses stay. The conquered waters bolt, divide, and form on either side a bay. And there in those wild days of yore, the Waka Maori floated light, and many a dusky maiden saw her lover on some starry night, and each read in the other's eyes the old story that never dies. Lost is the time in ages dim, since this stern peak first gained the name from wise Tohunga's visions grim, that placed it high in Maori fame. Ōnawe, home of him who holds the mighty winds that restless sweep, who bids them in their treacherous folds engulf the wanderers o'er the deep.
or curbs their restless course to calm, or lets the gentle zephyr play the wearied mariner to charm, and waft him on his watery way. Home of the spirit of the wind, where the dread Atawa held his sway, when luckless mortal sought to find him whom the winds alone obey, a dreadful voice in accents deep would call out from the rocky steep, "What want you here? Begone, begone." And lucky he if, ere the morn, the winds had spared from vengeance doer one who had braved the Atawa's power. The ages passed, and from the north the restless Pakeha racers came. Their cannons belched loud thunders forth. The Taniwha's gigantic frame, pierced by their lances, gave its life. And trees were felled, and a new light, foreboding change and peace from strife, dawned on the ancient Maori night. Then those stern gods, whose bloody reign had lasted from the ages past, saw that the struggle must be vain, and that their power had gone at last. For the blind faith that long had spread its shelter o'er them was no more, and once that faith in creeds is dead, their might is gone, their rule is o'er. Yet lingered in his storied place Ōnawe's spirit, though despair in windy tempests men might trace, that show the Atawas of the air were restless in their ancient hold, which ne'er again would faith enfold. At last, upon a fatal day, a young Ngaitahu warrior came and fired a musket in his play. A shudder shook the mountain's frame, a mighty tempest swept the deep, the great waves rolled, the thunders pealed, and dusky vapours sullen sweep and hide the heavens with livid shield. And o'er the summit of the storm the Atawa's voice came stern and high, and shadow of a mighty form rose godlike towards the darkened sky. "I go," the giant spirit cried. "Never again will Atawa's cry be borne on Whangaroa's tide, to warn of stormy danger nigh. But ere I fly, Ngaitahu here, thy faithless race has dared profane my sacred shrine, once held so dear, with murderous offspring of the brain of that new race that swept away the records of the ages past. Deluded Maori, thy brief day is setting, and the shadows vast close o'er Ngaitahu's helpless head, till it is numbered with the dead. Here on Ōnawe's fated strand, the last poor remnant of thy race shall struggle with their father's land, and coming Pakehas will trace the mighty earthworks raised in vain against the conquering northern train." The tempest ceased, the spirit fled. Once more the radiant sunbeams shed their glories over earth and sea, and the fierce tribe that long had stood owners of land and wave and wood knew well the Atawa's prophecy was true, and that Ngaitahu's race should quickly fall from power and place, and conquered fighting die. True was the Atawa's warning dread, ere 50 summer suns had shed their rays upon Ōnawe's head. The fierce Tauropraha came, and Ngatitoa's warriors bold stormed fierce Ngaitahu's storied hold, and left them scarce a name. And where the Atawa once had reigned, the dreaded northern warriors drained the lifeblood of their foes. But even now, when feuds are o'er, and peace reigns on the tranquil shore, the Maori chieftain shows the mighty earthworks of the past, where brave Ngaitahu made the last great struggle for their land, and fighting with their northern foes, found in grim death their last repose on fair Ōnawe's strand. Silas Wegg. End of section 43. Section 44 of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. The Legend of Gough's Bay. Where thy dark surge, O Karuru, rolls to its deafening ending, smiting the rolling sand at the base of the cliffs of obsidian, there stood the fated few, the last of the pride of Ngaitahu.
News had been brought in the evening that mad Ngāti Awa's dread warriors, full of revenge and hate, had found the pass through Waimomo and waited the coming of eve to sweep them to utter oblivion. Then spake Paihora, the chieftain, last of Ariki's relations, spoke to the trembling 40, all that were left of the hapu. Take our remaining treasures, take our punamu meres, take the tikis, the symbol, the atuas that once were protectors. Take the teeth of the shark, the mats of flax and of feathers. Take our choicest treasures, the wealth of our tottering hapu. Place in the walkers of Hiwi, the walkers that ply the Waimori. And you, O mothers of chieftains, Ohine, Raupate, Aroha, take the treasures and hide from the spoilers of fell Ngāti Awa. Say the sacred spells that will hide from the sight of Ngātoi. Burn the sacred fire that will make the tapu so mighty, that atuas of earth and of caverns, atuas of air and of ocean, all of those that are left of the fallen gods of Ngaitahu, shall watch with their terrible eyes the treasure bequeathed to their keeping. When the Ariki had spoken, forth went the mothers of chieftains, gathered the treasures, and placed them into the walkers of Hiwi, fastened the two together with strong korari most holy, took their paddles and started up from the sea to the valley, singing the sacred songs, the songs of the mightiest tohangas. Then Paihora gathered the remnant of the weeping Ngaitahu, placed in the waiti, walkers, the walkers that sail on the ocean, launched in the deadened surf that moaned at the loss of the hapu, gaining the open sea in search of a haven of safety. Vain the fugitives' hopes, for the Tanifas dread of Ngatoi. Tanifas might and dread the rangatiras of monsters misshapen that loved Ngāti Awa and hated the children of fated Ngaitahu. Stopped the beat of their paddles, held their blades in the water. Vain the strain of their muscles, vain their pride and their courage. Ngāti Awa is coming. Ngāti Awa has conquered. Nothing left them but death or slavery, bitter and hopeless. But the treasures were saved from the foe, for the mighty spells had been spoken to hide forever from men, till a fair-haired child of Ngaitahu should come in the far-off times and claim the wealth of her people. Well, the atuas have guarded thy hidden treasures, Ngaitahu. Mighty the tapu that covers the place where the walkers are lying. Oft is the Pakeha searching the stream, and the cave, and the forest. But safe as the Holy Grail from the eyes of the base and the guilty, lie the buried walkers of Hiwi, the treasure of fallen Ngaitahu. End of section 44. End of Tales of Banks Peninsula by Howard Charles Jacobsen.